At the same time, in another place, maybe in front of a two-story building on the schoolyard, a lot of people were walking back and forth. A girl with pink-red hair was sitting with her back against a chair when she heard someone call her name. Amy. It turned out to be Cherelle, who had just run over and was calling her. Cherelle, looking worried, stood in front of her and said, "Long time no see. You've lost a lot of weight. It looks like graduation classes are really tough." She handed Amy a stack of papers and gave a small smile, which revealed her dark under-eye circles, then said, "Sooner or later, you'll be just like me. Here's the material you asked for." After that, they sat down, had some drinks, and chatted. Cherelle looked at Amy and asked, "Was the promotion exam really that difficult?" Amy picked up her drink, took a sip, and answered, "It wasn't too hard, but the standards are really high. Even if you get a good score, it doesn't guarantee you'll pass." Amy made a cold expression, trying to scare her, and said, "They'll review everything you've done so far." Cherelle gasped, "Oh my, that's terrifying." But then Amy lowered her head and smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. Even though it's called a graduation class, it's basically the same as the advanced level 4 class. With your skills, you'll be fine." She lifted her cup with both hands and looked at Amy with admiration. "Wow, I think she's changed. Her mindset is much stronger now." While she was thinking this, Amy spoke up again. "So, how's Shirone doing these days?" When Cherelle heard that, it felt like a lightning bolt striking her, and she suddenly screamed in shock. "That's terrible. You two have never met before? Are you really dating?" She continued, "There's something really interesting going on lately." Her voice echoed by the sound of the running artificial waterfall. Amy, looking mostly uninterested, asked, "So, Aruki challenged Chiron, huh?" She looked at Cherelle, who was nervously explaining, and said, "When I was in 5th grade, he challenged me too. He's kind of strange. He acts like he doesn't care about anyone. But once he defeats you, he'll use that feeling to taunt you." Hearing that, Cherelle was confused. "So, he's some kind of genius hunter. Something like that? What about our Chiron? Aren't you going to help him, Amy?" Cherelle anxiously kept asking her. Amy, however, just rested her head on the arm of the chair, calmly sipping her drink as she replied, "Why would I? He doesn't need my help." "What do you mean? Our Chiron?" she suddenly shouted. "You're being so heartless. Why are you acting cold toward your boyfriend?" Amy raised an eyebrow, took a sip from her straw, and softly said, "No, that's not what I meant." Then she firmly added, "Shirone knows exactly what he needs to do." Over here, he was panting heavily, his face drenched in sweat. It turned out he had just finished the speed typing test. Everyone was amazed when they saw the score displayed on the wall. Timeout level 30, score 700, and time limit 0 minutes. As for Shirone, he was struggling to catch his breath. He had his hands on his knees, crouching down and loosening his tie. It seemed like he had pushed himself to the limit. The two people who had been standing under the podium earlier exchanged surprised comments. "I can't believe someone in the 5th grade class scored 700 points. That's one hell of a guy, a total monster." The crowd was buzzing with excitement. To get that score, you have to level up 10 times in just 10 seconds. "I can't believe it actually happened." Chiron frowned, stumbling as he walked, clearly exhausted. Aruki, hands in his pockets, walked up to him with a smug look and said, "Congrats, 700 is a really high score. Not bad, huh?" Chiron, breathing heavily, glanced over his shoulder and replied, "I wanted to show you something." Aruki closed his eyes, smirking as he passed by him. "I knew it." Cherelle's voice rang out, "So, do you think Chiron can win?" Amy, sipping her water and staring at the sky, responded nonchalantly, "What does it even matter if you win or lose? It's just a test." She was taken aback, looking at Amy in surprise, and asked, "What? Are you flexing your undefeated Amy reputation now?" Then she yelled, "I know you beat Aruki, the one who set the record with 987 points in the speed test." Amy frowned and replied, "No, I've never competed with him. I just ignore his trash talk." She then glanced off to the side and said, "But if we actually did compete, I'd probably lose." Her tone was serious. Cherelle blinked in confusion, and then her voice rang out again, "Oh." Back at the competition, the blackboard lit up, showing the word over. 701 points in 0 minutes. A crowd in the stands screamed, "Amazing. That's Aruki's score." Chiron was standing there, staring at his result. Someone in the crowd shouted, "He did it again, just 1 point at a time. I can't believe he scored 700 points and still looks so calm. What's Aruki's limit?" Everyone was wondering the same thing. Chiron stood there, bewildered, thinking to himself, "I don't think I can beat him." He then looked up at Aruki with a frustrated expression, suddenly coming to the conclusion, "I can't win against him." His bag was casually tossed onto the table. He sat silently on the simple bed in the large room. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting its light directly on his face. He looked out the window deep in thought. When the break ends, the exams will start. I only have 3 days. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and sighed. I can't find any other way to beat Aruki in that amount of time. Should I just give up? It's just a test after all. Suddenly, he remembered a phrase. Only the weak would say that. He fell silent, furrowing his brow as he thought. He recalled Aruki's cold expression when he said, "If you don't have the skills, fine. Go ahead and idealize life and pretend you're the best." His expression changed instantly, frustration crossing his face. He remembered a series of painful and unfair things he had experienced recently. Then he thought, no one will believe what I say. The last image that flashed in his mind was when he was a child, seeing the bodies of several people scattered on the street in the alley. He then struck a match and lit a candle. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, he stared at the burning candle on the table, deep in thought. Have I lost my sense of reality because I've been at the noble school too long? Actually, Aruki's words aren't wrong. And then he thought, the world won't listen to those without power. Chiron's eyes suddenly turned blue, and he whispered to himself, I won't give up. He sat up straight, closed his eyes, and focused. To overcome Aruki, there's no way forward except to overcome the numbers. Droplets of water slowly shrank and formed numbers greater than 1. A question flickered in his mind. What are numbers? In the depths of his consciousness, Shirone was floating, surrounded by numbers. He quietly asked, what is this sequence of numbers? He gathered the numbers into a circular field of light glowing brightly in the palm of his hand. He lifted it to eye level and stared at it. What is its core? He thought about it quietly, pondering the meaning. Then he raised his hand toward the sky and released the light. He continued thinking, if I stay trapped in these thoughts, I won't be able to see the bigger picture. As he thought, he relaxed his arm, letting it drop. Tiny blue lights began to fall slowly. As he felt them, these lights broke into even smaller ones, falling one after the other. More and more lone lights cascaded down, enveloping Chiron's body. His form was floating in midair, transparent and glowing blue. His eyes widened as he stared at them, wondering how far he could count. Then he thought that maybe he could. Chiron is flying up toward the light. He then pondered, how far will this go? He flew toward a barrier, like a surface of water rippling. In the middle, there was a hole, like a whirlpool. As he flew into it, his thoughts raced. What is this? The end of numbers? That can't be. Numbers are endless. Chiron placed his hands on the jagged edge, confused, and thought, so, what is this? Suddenly, the space around him began to crack. He was astonished, his mouth wide open in shock. The ground beneath him began to crack too. He looked down and could only mutter, huh? Then the crack under his feet widened, forming a large hole. He froze, unsure of what to do. Back in reality, he snapped his eyes open in panic. He sat up, breathing heavily, and thought, I must have reached it. What was that? Was it an illusion? The candle on the table had burned out, leaving only the wax remains. He stared at it, deep in thought. Could it be that I've reached the limit? Was it really an illusion? I felt such a strong pull. Chiron sat cross-legged on the bed, raised his hands, and blankly stared out the window. It was hard to explain, but perhaps numbers weren't just meant for counting. He looked up at the bright moon above the castle and thought about it. Chiron later realized that 40 hours had passed since she closed her eyes. The next day, the speed shooting test for the first level training field was scheduled. It was the day of the 5th grade class's speed shooting exam. On the field, 2 people were standing in the center. The stands around them were filled with spectators. The scoreboard on the wall was already up and running. Someone sighed and said, I'm so nervous, so nervous. It was the 2 male students again. The one on the left, sounding confused, spoke up, why are the lower grade students here? The one on the right frowned and replied, they probably came to watch. I've done that before. Suddenly, everyone looked toward the door. Oh, over there? Is that? Someone exclaimed in surprise, why are the seniors from the 4th grade here too? Among them was Cherelle. The male student who had been crying earlier held his head and said, this is too much pressure. The student on the right awkwardly tried to reassure him, don't worry. They're all here to watch the match between Chiron and Aruki. That's probably why, right? The people sitting behind didn't dare to say anything when Cherelle and her friends took someone else's seat. She smiled with her eyes narrowed, raised her hand, and said to the student whose seat was taken, thanks. The crying student replied, oh, of course. He looked up at the schedule for the day. So many events. A voice echoed. The main event of the day appeared on the blackboard. Aruki and Shirone would face off in Group 20. A guy with pink hair wondered aloud, I wonder who will win. The person sitting in the middle stroked his chin and answered, Aruki's ahead right now. Cherelle raised her finger confidently and said, it's still too early to say. She then looked at them, smiling mischievously as she added, since the test is done in groups, the score could change. If it were a real-life situation, Chiron would win. She said it with full confidence. A minute passed and the test ended. In the first round, the person on the left won with a score of 427. He happily raised 2 fingers and said, "I won." The other person wasn't satisfied. Even though the test was over, he still felt angry. Cherelle sat in the stands, frowning, resting her chin in her hand as she thought out loud, "But what should I do? I'm so nervous." A minute passed and the test ended for Mead's group. He stood, wiping sweat from his forehead, feeling secretly pleased. "I did way better than I thought." Athela, standing behind the desk, spoke up, "Great job, Group 19. She then flipped through some papers, smiling with her eyes as she said, "Now it's the last group, Group 20. As soon as she finished speaking, the crowd cheered, their voices filling the room. Aruki and Shirone stepped into their positions at the same time. The crowd shouted their names in unison. "Shirone, Aruki." The echo of their voices still rang out. Aruki and Athela both felt a sense of unease in their hearts. He stood still amidst the cheers of the crowd. Shirone should have spoken up casually, but he seemed too focused. His 2 friends raised their fingers to their lips, signaling him to be quiet. The cheers gradually faded. The 2 of them were now standing in the center of the arena. Athela's voice rang out, "You have 1 minute." She stood behind them and added, "Many students are watching you, so I hope both of you will do your best." Chiron, listening intently, gave a slight nod. Aruki, on the other hand, seemed uninterested. Athela then said, "All right, let's begin." The information board on the wall displayed 2 buttons, yellow for Aruki and red for Chiron. The yellow button beeped and everyone fell silent, their eyes fixed on the arena. Chiron started counting in his head, his eyes glowing brightly just like in his dreams. Then the red button beeped as well. Both of them had activated their fields, starting their battle. Each of them used their own unique techniques. Aruki's attack was powerful and winding, while Chiron's was sharp and precise. The crowd in the stands watched in awe, gasping, "Incredible." Now, both were at level 12. In the first 2 seconds, someone exclaimed, and as soon as it began, every target exploded. Chiron's eyes gleamed with a blue light. He focused all of his energy into the palm of his hand. The crowd screamed in admiration. They were both so skilled. Aruki threw his attack while glancing over at Chiron. Someone commented that Aruki's energy field seemed smaller now. It was true. Aruki's moves were getting sharper and faster, easily breaking through targets. The person sitting next to Cherelle crossed their arms and said, "So that's the power everyone's been talking about. It's impressive." Cherelle responded with a serious expression. "So this is why Amy called him a strong opponent, Chiron." Then she blinked in surprise. "Huh? Chiron's score is higher." She looked up at the scoreboard and gasped. Chiron has 121 points, while Aruki has 119. She then shouted angrily, "That idiot Aruki is messing around again? Does he think he can turn the situation around by playing games? How ruthless." At that moment, Aruki, still smiling, could barely keep his laughter in. Everyone misunderstood him. He swung his hand and grinned, thinking to himself, "I've been giving it my all from the start." He glanced at Chiron, sadly wondering what has this guy done in just 3 days. Aruki kept his eyes on Chiron, focused on unleashing his next move. On the platform, Athela was watching him closely, her expression serious. She thought to herself, "I understand now. The first time you take a path, it feels long, but once you've walked it again, it's quicker." She stared at Chiron, still deep in thought, and continued, "Counting is the same. You've come a long way already, Chiron." Aruki looked at Chiron, a smile that seemed a little off, and muttered, "This guy is crazy." Chiron quickly swung his hand forward, focusing his energy into his palm, firing at the target and making it explode one after another. Afterward, he stared at his hand and silently thought to himself, "Release the module." Athela, standing outside, was amazed. She began to think he's gathering the numbers together and performing calculations at the same time. This strategy can only be used when someone has reached the limit of cognitive calculations. She remembered when Chiron entered the arena. To be able to do this, he must have already entered a state of intense focus before stepping in. However, if he did that, he was now completely focused, aiming to attack as quickly and accurately as possible. He reminded himself, "If I make even the slightest mistake in the matrix, all my efforts to maintain this continuous focus will be for nothing. I have to stay focused no matter what." He furrowed his brow, thinking this. In his mind, a streak of golden light shot straight toward the source of the light up ahead. On the information board on the wall, the scores of the 2 players were rising. Chiron was in the lead with 469 points, while Aruki had 432. The gray-haired person sitting next to Cherelle suddenly exclaimed. The gap between their scores was widening. She and the girl beside her slammed their hands on the table, stood up abruptly, and shouted, "Chiron, go!" Everyone in the stands jumped to their feet, cheering loudly. The blonde girl with 2 braids yelled toward the arena, "Go faster." The match on the field was intense, with both fighters showing off incredibly powerful and lightning-fast moves. The crowd was thrilled, praising the action. Aruki, while landing a blow to destroy the target, thought to himself, this could be considered a form of encouragement. Cherelle, breaking from his usual strategic style, meant he was betting everything on this move. Aruki glanced at Shirone and smirked. All right then, I don't underestimate you, Shirone, he said. Your spirit is just as strong as mine. Then he immediately clenched his fist, silently adding, but my gamble will always be on a completely different level. Aruki focused his mind, his eyes narrowing coldly, and the air around him crackled with blue lightning. Suddenly, the crowd froze in confusion. Some people stood up, others rubbed their eyes, trying to figure out what was going on. Something felt off. Aruki's score. Someone yelled in astonishment. His score just shot up out of nowhere. Aruki's score on the board skyrocketed suddenly, overtaking Shirone's by a level. The two standing with Need earlier were also left wide-eyed in shock. But I don't think Shirone is falling behind at all right. Someone on the left commented. The rhythm of Aruki's explosions just changed in such a strange way, said the person on the right. Need stared blankly, thinking, this can't be happening. Cherelle's group of three had all stood up, and the girl with pink hair asked, did anyone else notice something strange about Aruki's aura? She frowned and replied, I noticed it. That's not just an aura. Cherelle's eyes widened in panic as she pointed ahead and shouted, he has two auras at once. Two more auras appeared around Aruki, surrounding him. Now, everyone was stunned. Someone shouted, that's even possible. Athela, amazed, began to think it over. Twin auras were a sign of the rare mental shift technique. She never imagined she'd see a student use it. What was even more surprising was that he was performing two continuous chains of actions while also recording the process. She stared deep in thought. Even if he had a genius-level condition, this ability was still extremely rare. She never expected such a hidden talent from a child like him. Then Athela quietly muttered to herself, another unexpected variable has appeared at this magic academy. Cherelle and her friend were still focused on the arena below. She mumbled, Amy was right. Aruki's twin auras passed through the target and flew across the space under the ceiling. Cherelle's voice rang out, Aruki really is a monster. Aruki raised his arms straight ahead, directing his twin auras to smash the target. The scores of the two people suddenly stopped. Aruki's was 845 and Shirone's was 692. Someone's voice spoke up. It's over. Need's group of three watched intently. The person on the left said, looks like everyone has figured out the result. Then he continued, Shirone's really unlucky this time. He stood silently, struggling to catch his breath. He felt helpless, thinking to himself that, in the end, he still couldn't win, even after betting everything he had. Chiron was suspended in front of the cliff, lost in his dream. It was clear he had given his all, and now he felt exhausted. He thought to himself, but he still couldn't match Aruki, not even half. He sadly reflected, I gave it everything. His hand went limp, but then he clenched it into a fist. Chiron thought again. Everything? A bead of sweat trickled down as he lowered his head, staring with a determined look in his eyes. No, it's not that. I'm still scared. Chiron was afraid. He wondered whether he was even allowed to walk down this path. Then he raised his fist into the air and punched hard at the cliff face in front of him. But at this point, it didn't matter anymore. Chiron thought to himself. A crack appeared on the cliff face as he pulled his fist back. Then Chiron swung his fist up high, gathering momentum. His teeth clenched, his eyes fixed on the hole with resolve. I'll break through it with my own hands. A powerful force hit the cliff face, creating a huge hole. Suddenly, it started to glow. Chiron was stunned when he saw that. The bright white light reflected off his face, lighting up the entire space in his mind as if it were daylight. Back in the arena, Athela was startled and turned her head to look at Chiron. She glanced over, puzzled. Chiron, I can't believe all the targets are being pierced right through the center by Chiron's yellow beams of light, each one just a few millimeters wide. The light was really small. The crowd in the stands gasped again, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Someone shouted, Holy shit, look at Chiron. The light is getting brighter and brighter. Cherelle's group was also freaking out, practically ready to dive onto the battlefield. But Chiron did make a sound. He just stood there, head lowered. The light coming from him was so intense that the green targets turned black. Then they were completely shattered into pieces by the beam of light coming from Chiron without him even having to do anything. Both scores were rising quickly, but it seemed like Chiron's was going up faster than Aruki's. Aruki turned to look at Chiron again, cleared his throat, then grinned through gritted teeth, thinking to himself, doesn't matter how fast you are, I'll definitely calculate faster than you. The remaining time was down to just 5 seconds. Aruki was still confident. I'll calculate every single number in the world, he said firmly. However, his domain was still speeding up, and there were only 4 seconds left. Aruki's domain hit the target, and there were only 3 seconds left. He thought to himself, I'm ahead. I can win this. Only 2 seconds left now. Just 1 more second to go. And finally, it was only 1 second remaining. Aruki grimaced, gritting his teeth, and muttered to himself, Damn it. Why is time moving so slowly? Everyone stood up and shouted as the match came to an end. Aruki suddenly slumped to the floor, deep in thought. It was over. He looked up at his score, feeling smug. Oh, not bad at all. Did I win? His score was 1247. Then Aruki turned to Shirone, wondering, how did Shirone do? He glanced at Shirone with a confused expression. Shirone still wasn't reacting. Suddenly, someone rushed over, shook Shirone's shoulder, and called out loudly, Shirone. That's when Shirone finally snapped out of it, exhaling sharply. It was Cherelle, who was slowly letting go of his shoulder. She looked worried and asked, Shirone, are you okay? The people around them gathered closer, watching anxiously. Then, Shirone spoke up, Sister Cherelle, the test was. Then she turned her head, looked at the board on the wall, and happily said, The victory belongs to you. He was incredibly surprised when he looked up at the scoreboard. She continued, You set a new record. The score you got is 1253. The other students happily gathered around and said in unison, Congratulations, Chiron. He was stunned, thinking to himself, Did I really win? Suddenly, Aruki walked up to Chiron and called out to him, Hey you. Chiron looked at Aruki, his eyes wide with surprise. Everyone around them seemed just as shocked. Aruki then added, You know, using area-wide magic is banned in the rapid-fire tests, right? Chiron immediately closed his mouth and thought, That's right. The entire arena was covered in light back then. Aruki's voice rang out again. Ha ha ha, you're really clueless, huh? Aruki slipped his hands into his pockets, then extended one hand to offer a handshake. He grinned and said, Just kidding. Having photon emission doesn't mean you're using photon magic. Congratulations on your win. The other Gale students, hearing this, all shouted in shock, Oh shit, Aruki actually admits he was beaten. Is the sun rising in the west today? Chiron took Aruki's hand, stood up, and said, So, are you finally admitting what I said? That life is more important than research? Aruki replied seriously, Yes, you're right. Chiron, almost unable to believe what he was hearing, asked again, Huh? Are you serious? Aruki calmly responded, Well, it seems like you misunderstood something. A bomb doesn't necessarily mean violence. Everyone around them was confused, not really understanding what they were talking about. Aruki continued, A bomb is just a large amount of accumulated energy. To count as violence, the intent of the user has to be to harm others. Need and Cherelle stood together, wide-eyed and confused. Need quietly spoke up but Chiron wasn't paying attention. He furrowed his brows and countered, But that kind of energy is controlled by humans, right? That means it's still dangerous, isn't it? Aruki replied, Well, then the person who controls it has to take responsibility for managing that enormous amount of energy. And by the way, while we're on this topic, I need to ask you something. Chiron looked at Aruki, his expression full of confusion. With a serious face, he said, From now on, you'll be responsible for me. Aruki's voice rang out, An explosion is just a large, uncontrollable energy. But if we can control it, that same energy could save 100,000 lives. He spoke seriously, and a strange light shone in the dark sky, casting its glow over a city. Aruki stood facing Chiron and said, A new era has begun. We're not just fighting nature anymore, but of course, I'm not some noble soul with high ideals. Chiron stood there silent for a moment before speaking up. Why didn't you say that from the beginning? If you had, I wouldn't have misunderstood. Everyone standing around, whispering and judging us. Aruki replied, I wanted you to realize where you stand to understand that you have the power. Chiron, surprised by Aruki's words, paused, and Aruki then spoke firmly, Or are you someone who only knows fear? Chiron stared ahead, thinking, I get it now. Aruki is afraid his power might get out of control. He looked at Aruki and thought this to himself. Aruki, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, said, If you defeat me, you'll prove your will. So the only one who can stop me is you. Chiron, still standing there in shock, listened as Aruki continued in a serious tone. If you can't handle me, then I won't take another step. The people standing behind Chiron exchanged confused glances, and one of them quietly murmured, Oh my, it's he saying he won't move because he's afraid of his own power. Chiron was uncertain, unsure what to do. Suddenly he spoke again, feeling completely lost. I still don't understand what's going on here. Chiron looked at Aruki worried. I can't tell if he's delusional or just being realistic, but there's something I know for sure. Chiron stared into Aruki's eyes and silently thought, the fear in his eyes is real. He then stepped forward, took Aruki's hand, and said firmly, I promise. He locked eyes with Aruki and continued with determination. When the time comes, I'll stop you. Everyone in the courtyard had no idea what was happening and all shouted together, "What?" Meanwhile, Need, tears streaming down his face, rushed over to the two of them, calling out, "Guys." Then he threw his arms around their necks, pulling them into a hug with a big smile, saying, "That was so awesome. I'm so proud to have you guys as friends." Athela, standing behind the crowd, spoke up, "Shirone, come here for a moment." He turned his head and replied, "Yes, ma'am." Aruki, still stuck in Need's tight embrace, could barely breathe. Chiron then followed Athela outside. Suddenly, she grabbed his shoulder, making him flinch as she sharply said, "Chiron." She looked at him with concern and shouted, "Do you even realize what you just did? Do you really want to leave here?" Chiron was stunned by her words. He stammered, "Professor Athela." She frowned and said, "If you go down that path, if you enter that world, you won't be yourself anymore." Chiron slowly lowered his gaze, looking down in frustration, and spoke softly. "I'm sorry, teacher. I didn't know it was this dangerous." Athela's voice was gentle as she replied, "Chiron." She lowered her head in thought, then gave him a serious look as she continued, "The territory you stepped into goes far beyond mere numbers. It's called the Infinite Realm. Sorcerers often refer to it as the immortal function." She looked into his eyes and added, "Our monks call it nirvana." The mention of that word shocked Chiron. A person could reach the infinite, but those who do would no longer be human. He thought to himself, beyond the numbers, what he saw in that place, the face of the enemy he had shattered, a vast space. Chiron felt as if something was pulling him forward. His thoughts kept drifting, and it felt like he was being drawn into it. Suddenly, Chiron woke up with a start. He was gasping for breath and pressed his hand to his forehead. He swung his legs off the bed and leaned on the table, lost in thought. Back to that nightmare again. "Ever since I entered that place, I've been having this nightmare every day," he said. "There's this strange feeling inside me." He picked up his glass of water, but his hand shook, causing the glass to tip over. Suddenly, his whole body trembled. He braced himself against the table to stay upright, and with his other hand, he grabbed the fabric of his shirt at his chest. He felt anxious and frightened, thinking that sometimes he sensed something was wrong. "I asked Professor Athela, but neither of us could figure out what's happening with my body." He looked at the puddle of water that had spilled on the table, worrying written all over his face. "What the hell is happening to me?" One afternoon, the birds were flying back to their nests. Chiron's voice echoed in the room. "Lately, I think I've been haunted." He sat in the chair, his face showing clear exhaustion from not being able to sleep well. Aruki and Need sat nearby, and upon hearing him, they both looked at him with curiosity. The three of them were in some room together. Need, sitting on the left on the couch, scratched his head and grinned, saying, "You look so serious, I actually got worried." Chiron, slumped in the chair, responded lazily, "I am serious." "You said this was a research group on paranormal science, didn't you?" Aruki said, crossing his arms and smiling wryly. "Yeah, the level of worry from someone who's beaten me is on a whole different level, so I'm surprised, but why did you think he was being serious?" Chiron chuckled bitterly, pointing his finger at Aruki. "Did I ask something stupid?" Aruki rested his chin on his hand, looking at Chiron before speaking again. "The dream you mentioned, you said you saw yourself in an empty, dark space, right? And then the stars were being sucked in from somewhere." Chiron just gave a casual "yeah." Aruki's voice continued, and finally, that barrier broke apart and a burst of light shot out. "Is that right?" Chiron widened his eyes and answered, "Ah, yeah, that's right." It was like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Aruki sat with his arms crossed, leaning back in his chair. He looked at Chiron and said, "Considering both the size and speed of the space you're talking about, it's a number that no one on this continent could ever guess." Now, Aruki had a new nickname, Mercadang Aruki, Spiritual Critic. Aruki joked, "If we assume that place is real." Then he became serious and continued, "It must be beyond the universe." Need and Chiron were taken aback, both sitting up straight and staring at Aruki. In unison, they exclaimed, "Beyond the universe?" Need looked at Aruki, his face filled with doubt, and said, "Are you talking about the universe mentioned in the books? But how could I even dream about it if I've never seen it?" Need rested his chin on his hand, eyeing Chiron sharply, and said, "No." He raised his hand and said with a serious expression, "I've heard about it." Chiron awkwardly called out, "Need." And Need also got a new nickname, Need, Spiritual Inquirer. He continued seriously, 200 years ago, a condemned prisoner underwent a soul-switching experiment. If a person's soul could be turned into physical matter, there was a theory that electricity could separate it. A sealed conductor, meaning they would put someone in a metal box and run electricity through it, but the experiment was deemed inhumane and was stopped long ago. The prisoner survived. His consciousness returned after a month. He paused for a moment, then continued. He learned about the situation in countries outside the continent. about places he'd never been to or even heard of. Shirone nervously asked him, "Is that really true?" Need rested his elbows on his thighs and answered quietly, "The information the prisoner on death row shared has been verified, and everything has been confirmed as true." He glanced over at Shirone with a look that almost seemed like a warning. "The soul has been separated by electricity and then gradually ionized, which created electrons. Is it this power that attracted the information about the world to the prisoner? That was just a theory. The strange tingling sensation the prisoner experienced. That's called a spiritual feeling," Need said. As soon as Shirone heard him, goosebumps immediately covered his skin. He hugged his arms tightly and, with a fearful voice, said, "Oh my god, it's itching, just like what I'm feeling." Aruki suddenly stood up, startling Shirone, then spoke loudly. "That's why Shirone can see the universe out there. If your soul has been ionized by electricity causing quantum phenomena, then the possibility of you breaking through space and time becomes real." Shirone froze, confused. "Break through space and time." Aruki held up his thumb and index finger, leaving a tiny gap, no bigger than a grain of rice, and explained, "In a microscopic world smaller than an electron, can an event beyond human understanding happen? A world defined by probability, a place you can't observe and measure at the same time. If you think the weight of the soul was lighter than an electron atom, an electron orbit appeared in Aruki's imagination, and he continued, then the connection between space and time wouldn't mean anything." Aruki then pointed his finger at the ceiling, looked at him, and concluded that sensing the space beyond was possible, so he pointed at him excitedly and asked, "What do you think?" "I think it's exactly your case," Shirone shouted in admiration, then said loudly, "You got it, huh? This is amazing. You too look like this, but you're actually a real research team." Shirone praised them, and Need smiled and showed his teeth in response. "It doesn't seem that special, does it?" Aruki replied, grinning proudly, sitting with his arms crossed, then added, "It's just a hypothesis. To do real research, we need more information." Then Aruki asked, "So why haven't you told the truth yet?" He looked confused, not understanding what Aruki meant. Aruki gave Shirone a cold stare. During the speed shooting test, there was an issue with his self-luminescence. He also mentioned that after that day, he started having nightmares every night. "Tell us what happened," Aruki said, genuinely wanting to know what was going on. He awkwardly looked down at the table. Then Shirone told them the story. "Actually, Professor Aruki did tell me a few things." After they both heard it, Need was shocked and shouted, "The immortal function? What is that?" "Aruki, do you know what it is?" Aruki stood there without answering, only letting out a small laugh. Shirone looked a bit panicked, glanced at Aruki, then sighed and tilted his head back, laughing out loud. "I get it now. So that's what it is, the immortal function." Aruki continued, "I've heard my father mention it before. It's the dream of mathematicians, a function that holds the key to everything in this world." Need and Shirone both felt a bit uneasy hearing that. He awkwardly said, "But the professor also said that it's really dangerous." Aruki spread his arms wide and said loudly, "Of course, because to have everything is to have nothing." Then Aruki covered his mouth, giggling, and said, "I got it now. To defeat me, you need the immortal function." Shirone, surprised but also relieved, looked at Aruki. He thought to himself that for some reason, seeing them joke around made him feel lighter. Shirone suddenly grew serious and said, "I've made up my mind. I'm going to join the paranormal research group." Aruki and Need both jumped up with excitement when they heard his decision, saying together, "Really?" Shirone answered, "Yeah, I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to research it myself and face it head on." Shirone stood up, squinting and smiling as he said, "If I'm working with you guys, I'm sure I'll find something." Need raised both arms to the sky and shouted, "This is awesome. Whether it's the immortality formula or whatever else, we'll make it through. We've got enough people now. We're finally an official team. I'm so happy. We'll get our funding again." Aruki added, "But did you think the professor will actually let Shirone join? Our reputation isn't exactly great." Need mischievously held up a piece of paper and said, "Just trust me. I'll get Shirone in without the professor ever knowing." Shirone and Aruki both looked at each other in confusion and said in unison, "Is that really okay?" Need immediately rushed over, hugged both of them, and with a big grin said, "Don't worry, everything's fine. Let's go grab coffee and throw a party to welcome our new member." Need continued, "I'm paying today." Aruki coldly reminded him, "But you still owe money to the cafeteria." As for Shirone, he didn't say anything. He just glanced around thoughtfully. This was his research team now. He looked around the lab and thought, "All right, let's start by cleaning up." Later that afternoon, things didn't go as Need had hoped. Someone had gotten their hands on the paperwork to form the team, and it was clear that person was very angry. The scariest professor had discovered it, Saina. She had a very intimidating expression as she glared at the application form in her hand, her voice low and sharp. Someone's voice echoed, "Professor Thad." "That's it." The man, holding a stack of papers up to his nose, glanced back and answered, "Ah, the application to join the research group. This always happens around the holidays." He kept walking while talking, not noticing that one of the papers had fallen to the floor and scattered around a bit. After some time, once the exercise was done, the group broke up. "Let's just get this over with quickly," he muttered. Stanga saw the paper on the ground and spoke up, reminding him, "Professor, you dropped this." He jumped, startled, and exclaimed, "Oh no!" She picked up the form and looked at it. "This is." Thad leaned in to see and furrowed his brow, asking, "Huh? Professor, this research group. What is this research group?" Thad hesitated. They both looked down at the application form. "A research group on supernatural soul science from the Need group." His voice was filled with surprise. "A research group on supernatural souls?" Then Thad's gaze shifted to the name Arian Shirone on the form. He glanced at Sena and asked, "Isn't that you, Shirone?" Sena's face darkened and she said nothing. She then crumpled the form tightly in her hand, her smile turning terrifying. Inside the relatively low mountain range, deep in the hills, there was a house and the voice of someone echoed outside. "I'm sorry, Professor Athela, you're still in the middle of your practice." She sat cross-legged at the tea table, lifted her cup, smiled with squinted eyes, and spoke. "You come all the way here, so it must not be a simple matter. Professor Sena, so this is Athela's house." The atmosphere fell silent for a moment as the two sat across from each other, sipping their tea. The surrounding scene was peaceful. Sena set her cup down and said, "Actually, Chiron has joined a research group." Athela happily asked, "So she finally joined a group? Which one is it?" Sena leaned forward, her face serious, and said, "It's a research group studying supernatural souls." Athela took a sip of her tea, but when she heard that, she froze. Tea almost spilled out of her cup. Sena, both frightened and trembling, continued, "As you know, even before we became professors, this group has a history of causing trouble. Every day I get tons of complaints from parents. She grew more anxious. Why that group? Chiron is the future of our school. She should be focusing on her studies right now." Athela paused, stopped sipping her tea, looked at her with a silly smile, and said, "But isn't that group different now?" She raised her finger and tried to defend Mead's group. "The president right now is Need, a very well-behaved student who gets along with everyone, so there shouldn't be any problems. The troublemakers have all graduated already. The current president of the Thormia Magic Association is the former president of that group," she said cheerfully. She continued, "I'm sure they'll all share good things and focus on their studies." Meanwhile, over with Need's group, he was lying back on the couch, looking completely relaxed. Need greeted Chiron. "Oh, Chiron, you're here." He stood by the door, frowning and using his sleeve to wave away the dust that was rising in the air. Annoyed, he said, "You guys, I can see the dust flying up from the ceiling, all over the room." Chiron, standing by and brushing the dust away, replied, "Aren't you going to school?" "I wasn't feeling too well today, so I'm just resting." With my head on the pillow and legs crossed on the couch, Need answered, "I'm not feeling great today." Aruki, meanwhile, was sitting on a chair, focused on playing a game of chess, and casually said, "I skip school all the time." Then, with excitement, he focused even more on his game. "All right, checkmate in one more move." His hands quickly moved two pieces at once. Chiron stood behind him, just watching in silence, not saying anything else. Then, he turned to the mess on the right and thought to himself, "I already cleaned this up. Why is it a mess again?" After a moment, he spoke up, "You guys aren't studying or doing research, and now you're even skipping school." Need looked up with a confused expression and replied, "Huh? You can regret it all you want, but you're not going anywhere." Chiron turned away, sighing as he took off his outer uniform and said, "I'm studying." With that, he walked over to the round table next to the long desk, took out some documents, and sat down quietly to study. Aruki and Need silently watched Chiron. Need, lying on the couch, made a bored face and thought to himself, "What a model student." Suddenly, Aruki propped his elbows on the table, leaned forward, and smirked as he looked at Need, saying, "Need, you finished that new invention." Need turned over, propped himself up, and looked at him. "All right, of course I did." Haruki's voice rang out, catching Chiron's attention. "Is this the invisible cloak?" While Chiron was taking notes, he overheard Aruki. The two of them started talking excitedly. "Wow, this is so cool. It's amazing." "Yeah, totally." Chiron couldn't focus on studying anymore, so he perked up his ears, trying to listen in on their conversation. It lasts for an hour, and if you feed it energy like this, wow, this is amazing. At this point, Chiron couldn't pretend to be quiet anymore. He immediately stood up, looked at the two of them with curiosity, and shouted, "I want to see too." Back at Athela's house, Sena calmly lifted her cup of tea, took a sip, and then spoke. "We were talking about Need, so let's also talk about the others. That kid Aruki, he's in 5th grade, but he acts like he's clueless." In Sena's mind, two faces came to mind, Aruki and Chiron. She fell silent for a moment before continuing, have you seen his abilities? And Shirone even defeated the monster that Aruki couldn't. When the graduating class finishes, I think these kids will be the shining stars of our school. Suddenly, she placed her tea down on her lap with a rush, her voice growing tense as she shouted, but what if Shirone starts hanging out with troublemakers like Aruki and becomes as rebellious as he is? She'd turn into the biggest failure this academy has ever seen. Athela, hearing this, looked both confused and concerned as she asked, failure? Then Athela relaxed and spoke more calmly, oh my, you're worrying too much. Meanwhile, in a research room with the three of them, Shirone's voice sounded in awe as he saw a pile of strange objects that looked like grenades inside a wooden crate. Wow, did you make all of this, Need? So this is a magic grenade? The three of them were sitting around the wooden crate. Need propped himself up with his hands, then giggled and said, I'm saving these for a big show sometime, like a huge one. Shirone, sitting next to him, tugged at his invisibility cloak while lifting a round, pink grenade and asked skeptically, but it isn't that kind of dangerous. Aruki sighed, picked up his black book, and chuckled awkwardly, saying, come on, Need's dream is to become a magical engineer. That's why he's going to school. Since Shirone was wearing the invisibility cloak, only his head, the collar of his cloak, and his hands gripping the cloak were visible. When he heard Aruki, he looked at him with admiration and said, a magical engineer? That sounds awesome. So, you use electronics to make stuff like this? Then with a puzzled expression, he asked, but what's this book? The red one. Shirone reached for the red book and picked it up. Aruki and Need both glanced at it. Need gasped and said, huh, that's... Before he could finish, Aruki quickly interrupted, huh? Is this from the Human Anatomy Research Group? Why is it here? Shirone flicked open the book, but kept his eyes on Aruki, asking, Human Anatomy Research Group. Then, as he looked at the page he had just opened, he froze and screamed. The page Shirone turned to show pictures of two beautiful women. What is this? He hesitated, letting the book fall to the floor, then covered his face with both hands, leaving just one eye peeking through. Isn't that one of our school students? Aruki looked at the page, frowned slightly, and spoke. So it's here. He then turned to Shirone, who nonchalantly started to explain. This is like an info book from some shady research group. The drawings aren't great, but it's packed with insider info. Aruki said this in a tone full of disinterest. It's just something for bored kids to mess around with. But he didn't feel quite right about it and furrowed his brow, visibly uncomfortable. Isn't the school going to step in? Then suddenly his eyes widened and his cheeks flushed red. It turned out his reaction was because he had spotted a drawing of Amy in the book. Noticing his silence, Aruki asked, why aren't you saying anything? Shirone, are you really dating her? Before Aruki could finish his question, Shirone raised both hands to the sky, awkwardly stumbling over his words. You guys can't be looking at stuff like this. What the heck? Need saw Shirone like this, and Aruki raised his hand as if to say something, but only let out a surprised noise. Shirone quickly dropped his hands, looked at Aruki with a worried expression, and then quickly changed the subject. Who even runs a group like this? He answered calmly, it's a secretive underground group, but most of the stuff about the graduating class is probably written by the graduating class members themselves. Anne anxiously muttered, a graduation project, and yet we have a group like this? Under the eaves of Athela's house, the gentle, faint sunlight reflected off her roof. Saina's voice rang out, that's right. The research group on supernatural souls is just as shady. She then spoke with a cold expression, saying the dark sorcerer group is just child's play. The real problem is that it's a joke created by the most intelligent and talented students at the school. They each have different talents, like in painting or even eyes with supernatural powers. Saina continued, then paused. They're extremely advanced. They have talents in communication or research. She added, and they completely avoid the school's investigation system. Saina sat upright, her hands interlaced, and she seriously explained to Athela, the reason we haven't touched the supernatural soul research group is because it's no longer considered an official group. These gifted students are trying to revive it. Then, with a cold face and sharp eyes, she said, so, taking this opportunity, I will disband this group. Athela remained silent for a moment, then closed her eyes, pouring tea into a cup, and said, I understand your concern for the students. She was pouring tea into a cup while saying, however, there's a reason the school doesn't intervene in those groups. To help students develop independence, these research groups are considered independent. They must take responsibility for their own choices. On a high tree branch, there was a bird's nest with chicks of different colors, not the pink of the mother bird. The mother bird perched nearby, keeping watch over them. Athela continued, if we as adults take away that right from the students, they will start to fear making choices. Calmly, she subtly asked Saina, why don't we give them a chance? Saina stayed silent, closed her eyes, and thought for a moment. Then she furrowed her brow and spoke up, "Of course what you're saying is true," but she opened her eyes and looked at Ithella with concern, then countered, "I believe that developing students' talents and preventing them from making mistakes is also our responsibility as adults." Ithella looked at her quietly, thinking, "I can see how much Professor Sina cares for Shirone. I will give Chiron enough time to decide for himself, but I can't ignore her opinion either." After thinking for a moment, she spoke again. "I'm sorry I didn't mention this earlier, but this is about Chiron. In the recent speed shooting test, Chiron reached nirvana." Sina's eyes widened in shock when she heard this. She couldn't believe it was true. And then she screamed loudly. "What?" Sina's scream echoed through the mountains and forests, startling the birds resting on the tall tree branches. They panicked and flew up into the sky. Inside the research room of the three of them, the hanging light fixture on the ceiling suddenly shook violently, causing the ground to tremble nonstop. Chiron crouched on the floor, scared, and shouted, "Huh?" An earthquake. Need grabbed a cloak and shoved it into a wooden crate, speaking urgently, "This is bad. Hide everything quickly." Aruki also helped, gathering papers and placing them into the crate. Only Chiron seemed confused and asked, "Why? What's going on?" Aruki, while adjusting the couch, answered him, "A professor is controlling the storage room. Need needs to quickly adjust the table." Chiron just stood there watching them, then nervously asked, "What do we do now?" Aruki quickly replied, "Just wait." A hand pressed on the identification scanner by the door and a voice rang out. It was an emergency investigation. Sena stood, waiting for the door to open. She thought seriously, it takes 3 minutes to summon the desired storage room, enough time to hide the evidence. In the research room, Chiron was forced to sit down by Need and Aruki. He frantically yelled, "The professor's here and we're not going to greet her." Need replied with a serious face, while Aruki anxiously reminded him, "It's fine, just act like nothing's wrong. If we get caught, it's not just a suspension." After hearing their words, Chiron reluctantly followed their lead. Need sat cross-legged in the chair in the middle of the room, interlacing his fingers as he looked at him and said, "This is our turf, and if you get scared, it's over." Chiron hesitated for a moment, but responded, Okay. Sina walked in, exuding a cold, powerful aura. Her presence seemed to fill the room as she pushed open the door. In front of her were 3 people sitting in various postures. The room itself appeared perfectly normal, with nothing suspicious. Aruki sat with her arms crossed, looking up at Sena with a haughty expression. Need sat upright, hands resting on the table, slightly lowering his head as he glanced at her. Chiron looked serious, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Sena furrowed her brows as she stared at the 3 of them and thought to herself, "Before it's too late, I need to disband this group." But then her thoughts hesitated. "That's why I anticipated this reaction." Need, still with his legs crossed, coolly spoke up, "We apologize. We're in the middle of a debate." Sena wasn't happy with the way he was acting. That attitude was a bit annoying. Need was sitting with his legs crossed, elbow resting on the armrest, hands clasped together, and he was grinning with his eyes half closed as he said, "If you had sent an official message before coming, we would have welcomed you properly." Sena stopped looking at him, annoyed, and glanced to the side in silence, lost in thought. The thing that frustrated her the most was that Chiron was dragged into this mess too. On the outside, Chiron seemed perfectly fine. He just sat quietly, staring down at the table, but inside he was probably pulling his hair out, silently screaming. As Professor Sena, should I just sit here and be fine with this? After a moment, Sena smiled brightly and said, as if she didn't understand the problem, "When a guest arrives, don't you guys offer tea or a drink?" Need, still grinning, responded, "Oh wow, you really trust us enough to drink tea we serve." Chiron, sitting between the 2 of them, had frozen up, looking like he wanted to disappear. She pushed her glasses up with her index and middle fingers and smiled lightly with her eyes closed. "All right, I'll get straight to the point before I leave," she said seriously, sitting up in her chair. "I want you to return the research team's room." After she finished speaking, Aruki just gave her a stern look. Need smiled with his eyes narrowed, and Chiron looked a bit confused. Then the 3 of them leaned in toward each other wide-eyed and said in unison, "What?" Need suddenly slammed his hand down on the table, stood up, and in pain yelled, "Give back the room. Why is this happening?" Sena pulled out a folder and started flipping through it, then said, "I've looked through the documents, and it's hard to find a reason not to shut down this research group. The truth is, you haven't done anything in 4 years." Chiron broke into a cold sweat, looking over at Aruki, who seemed just as worried. Sena continued, "The truth is, you've been lacking students all semester. That's enough reason to close the group. Looks like your budget's been cut again, hasn't it?" Sena flipped through the papers, reading while speaking. "According to the policies, if you can create any value within a month, you can keep the research group open. Otherwise." Need suddenly knelt on the table, clasped his hands together, and bowed his head in desperation, surprising Chiron. I'll beg you for anything, but not for research results. He lowered his head and pleaded earnestly. The topic of supernatural research, it's something that can't really be proven, right? Do you really want to shut down the only research group that challenges a society that's too reliant on science and logic? We'll do anything except provide research results, please. Saina held the folder against her face, looking down at Need as she said, if that's what you want, I have another suggestion. Need, serious, spoke loudly, yes, I'll do anything. Saina looked at him with a heavy expression and said, expel Shirone from the group. Once she finished speaking, Need immediately lifted her head, looking at her in surprise. Shirone and Aruki were also equally shocked. All three of them were taken aback by her condition. Then they all shouted at once, why? After a brief discussion, Saina spoke up. Have you guys heard about this? Need and Aruki sat up straight in their chairs, both unsure of what to choose. Meanwhile, Shirone was made to sit in the chair across from her, looking just as confused. Senga stood behind the chair, arms crossed, and said, immortality is a huge issue that even students can't handle. It's extremely dangerous for a young student. Shirone could end up disappearing because of it. Shira looked up at her, both worried and dissatisfied, and replied, I already know it's dangerous. I won't do it again. She gave him a serious look, then turned to face him and said, that's not the point. The real issue is the overload that comes with it. Shira looked at Need and Aruki and asked, overload. What's that? Need seemed too frightened to answer, but Aruki frowned and explained, I guess I should explain it like a disease that geniuses get. I had it when I was 8, but it wasn't too severe. You repeat what your father said to you. He said, you're crazy, so just keep quiet and live with it. You speak with a tone full of curiosity. I don't know anything about it, Sena says, holding her forehead and speaking with a troubled look. I call it a problem because that's how you all see it. Overload is a phenomenon that happens when your mind can't fully control the amount of information that comes from suddenly waking up. The brain of the person who experiences it will have something accumulate inside and glow outwards. She continues, it's like a dam that can't stop the flood of water. It's a terrible symptom that can shatter your consciousness, but it's seen as a disease that only geniuses get. It's like a mother whose child is seriously ill in bed, but when she hears it's a disease of geniuses, she's both relieved and worried and doesn't treat it. Saya goes on, a lot of children miss the best time to get treatment and live their whole lives suffering from it, and they think that overload is the cause of immortality. Your teachers would never want to imagine how dangerous it really is. When you hear her, you frown, feeling uneasy and lost in thought. The collapse of consciousness. Maybe that's it. The nightmare you dream every night, your body often feeling strange, like a series of cylindrical threads inside you are writhing. Then you think to yourself, maybe I've really gone crazy. Sena stood there, frowning as she tried to persuade them. I think I'll let Shirone focus on psychological treatment while doing my best to minimize the impact on her studies. He lowered his head sadly. She continued, I'll handle things on my own to make sure there are no lasting effects. So, if you really care about your friend, shouldn't you be the ones to send Shirone away? Suddenly, Need shouted, cutting her off. No. She looked at Need in surprise. He spoke firmly and confidently, though there was still a hint of humor on his face. As president, I don't think you know everything. She angrily bent down and snapped. What? Is this the time to get upset? But it was Aruki who responded to her. Isn't this something Shirone decided on her own? Shirone was taken aback when she heard him say that. Then he spoke up again. I know you're worried, but don't you think this is a bit too much? Need, sitting beside him, was irritated and stood up. Exactly. I can tell you why you're going too far, Professor. It's because you like her. Like what? He hesitated, then, in a burst of anger, yelled. You like Shirone, don't you? Saina immediately responded to him. Yeah, what's the problem? When Need heard her reply, it felt like a lightning strike right next to his ear. He stood there, holding his head, tilted his neck back, and yelled out. Of course it's a problem. I never thought a professor could be attracted to a student. His face turned bright red, to the point where it seemed like smoke could rise from it. His eyes became blurry, almost dazed, and he said, So, if that's the case, you must like me, right? Sayana coldly responded without hesitation. No. He collapsed face down onto the blood-stained desk, groaning in dramatic despair. Shirone, standing nearby, panicked and said, The president's dead. Sayana immediately spoke up. I don't want to get dragged into that debate over what's right or wrong. Stop being so stubborn and accept the reality. Aruki stood there, looking at her, and then spoke. Professor, if Shirone can't handle the overload, does that mean this is as far as he can go? He's not actually dead, right? Shirone stood frozen, stunned by the question. Sena answered seriously. I think you already know the answer since you've experienced this before. This isn't just a normal situation. This is about immortality. Aruki frowned, confused. Immortality is a field that's never been fully understood. It's where Shirone has just taken a step. Shouldn't we trust him and wait? Are you worried he's pushing beyond his limits, Professor? Then Aruki emphasized serious in tone. And that's what everyone calls obsession. After hearing that, Saina just quietly looked down, pressing her lips together. She started to think, an obsession, huh? She remembered a moment from her childhood. Someone had called her name. Saina, you need to leave here. She recalled sitting alone in the middle of a forest, feeling confused and scared, hugging her head in distress. Suddenly, Chiron lifted his face and spoke. Like I thought, that's something you have to decide for yourself. Saina was startled and anxiously turned to look at him. Chiron, he said. Honestly, I'm also really scared. Like she said, Professor, there was a time I thought I was losing my mind. She panicked and spoke up. Then it starts now. But Chiron interrupted her. No, actually, I felt amazing. Saina stared at him in disbelief. Ha! Chiron placed his left hand on his chest, over his heart, and spoke warmly. It's not something everyone gets to experience, but it was meant to happen to you, right? I'm really afraid of the nightmares disappearing. If they go away, I won't be able to explore the secrets hidden deep inside me anymore. Then he lifted his gaze to look at her, his eyes full of confidence. If this is a question for just me, I want to find the answer. I don't want to run away from it. I want to face it. Saina sat silently, thinking that, just like her, she remembered a young man with blonde hair who had once reached out to help her. He had told her, don't run away, look straight ahead. And then she whispered to herself, she's just like him. After a moment, Saina nodded and said, I understand. I respect Chiron's decision and I will never think about her giving up again. The three of them were both surprised and relieved to hear that. Need, who had been hiding under the table, poked his head up and asked, so? She answered him, yes. Then she turned around, waved, and smiled brightly. We'll go back to the original terms. You'll show the results next month, right? Need frowned in confusion, muttered something under his breath, and then his face dropped into a disappointed frown. Right now, the three of them were sitting on the bench near the waterfall, each staring off in different directions, lost in thought. Need, on the other hand, looked completely absent, like his soul had left his body. Shirone, in a state of panic, asked, what should we do? So we need to show the research results in 1 month, right? Do you have any notes from past research? Need was too far gone to respond. He couldn't answer him. Aruki, furrowing his brow in deep thought, replied, from what I know, we've hardly researched anything at all. If anything, what we have is something about supernatural soul science from the textbooks. There's no evidence to prove the existence of souls. Aruki said this helplessly. Finally, Need spoke up, but his voice sounded strange. His face was pale, and he said, I'm sorry, former president. The research team will end with this generation. He said more, but it was inaudible. Chiron, with tears streaming down her face, still managed to encourage him, hang in there. Suddenly, Aruki, feeling bored and leaning back in his chair, sat up and said with bright eyes, that's a pretty girl, Chiron commended. Now's not the time for that. Focus and Need is still acting like a zombie, Aruki replied. But as soon as Need heard pretty girl, he immediately jumped up, cupped his hands around his eyes to get a better view, and kept asking, where? Where? They were looking at a girl in a long dress with flowing purple hair walking over there. Need couldn't take his eyes off her and exclaimed, who is that? Is there anyone like her in the advanced class? Aruki touched his chin thoughtfully and said, there's no one like her in the advanced class. Did she graduate already? Shirone, looking at them, asked in confusion, Aruki, do you remember every girl's face in the advanced class? Then Shirone noticed the girl looked a lot like Saina, and his face turned red as he frowned and gasped. After that, both Shirone and Need stared at the girl, and in unison they shouted, Professor Saina. Need then spoke loudly. There's no way. Can someone really change that much? Aruki looked at Shirone and asked, Shirone, you sure have an eye for girls, huh? Pervert. Shirone quickly tried to explain. No, it's not like that. Then he wondered aloud, but where's she been going on weekends? And she's wearing makeup too. They continued to watch Saina's figure as she walked away, taking turns discussing. Aruki guessed, is she going on a date? I mean, she's at the right age for it. Need doesn't believe anything. Does she have a boyfriend? Suddenly, Need stood up, muttering, this is the opportunity. Shirone, sitting next to him, wondered what he was planning to do. Then Need excitedly said, after we track down Professor Saina and figure out her weakness, we'll use it to stop the research group from being disbanded. Aruki spoke seriously. Chasing after a certified level 6 mage isn't easy, but we have the invisibility cloaks. With that, the two of them started running, leaving instructions for Shirone. Aruki said, I'll track the professor first. Go with Need, he added, and Need pointed a finger right at Shirone's face, shouting, I'm going to grab the cloak from the research room. You know how to keep a safe distance from the target, right? This is the only way to save the research group. They left him with only those words, and Shirone stood there completely confused. After a moment, he yelled, "Use your brains for studying, guys." Meanwhile, Saina had stopped, carefully scanning her surroundings with a wary, cautious look. The three of them were hiding behind the apple rack under their invisibility cloak. Aruki spoke up. "She's really alert. We almost got spotted." Need's super into this. He grinned slyly and said, "Looks like something's up. Who's she about to meet?" Shirone, feeling frustrated, said, "Why do we have to do this?" But then he nervously continued, "But there's something." When a noble goes on a date, the four of them were in a large, crowded marketplace with people bustling all around. Shirone wondered, aren't they supposed to avoid areas with regular people? Saina kept looking around nervously as she walked like she was on high alert. She even turned around carefully when she noticed something suspicious. After that, Saina quickly weaved through the market stalls. Haruki shared her thoughts. There's definitely something shady going on. She was very watchful of her surroundings, while Nii was more concerned about the fate of the documents. "Do you think the professor is selling off those weird items for money?" Chiron shot him a judgmental look. "You think she's like you?" Saina stopped in front of the door of a residential building in the neighborhood. She smiled as the door opened. A man reached out and embraced her, showing his happiness. The three of them were all taken aback and said in unison, "It's a man." Need, excited by what he had just seen, exclaimed, "Is this her secret boyfriend? Hot scoop! Is this a forbidden love the family doesn't approve of?" Both Aruki and Shirone turned their eyes to Need. "She's gone inside now. We should stop here." Despite his curiosity, Need couldn't hide his excitement. He quickly jumped up and ran down the street, filled with joy. "What are you talking about?" "We need to follow the professor and find evidence for the survival of the research team," Aruki said, feeling helpless alongside Shirone at Need's decision. Need signaled to Aruki. "Aruki, it's time." Aruki cleared his throat, mentally preparing himself. A wave of green light entered the metal pins inside the door. The lock on the outside clicked open under the pressure of the force, and Need, thrilled, shouted loudly, "We did it! The door's open." He swung the door wide, proudly showing off his prediction. "I knew the basement door lock was the loosest one. Let's go." With that, the three of them quickly explored the floors of the house. The first floor had nothing. "Great, let's break into the second floor. Use your field of shifting to check the hallway first." Shirone could only smile helplessly at the carefree attitude of his friends. Why don't these two use their intelligence and credible motivation for something like studying? The three of them, cloaked in invisibility, crept along the walls and listened closely. Suddenly, Need signaled, "Hull, I hear a woman's voice coming from that room." The room ahead was closed, and the sound Need had heard was coming from there. Shirone felt things were about to go too far, so she cried out and begged, "Please come back. I'm begging you." Need spoke up to stop her. "Professor Sina was the one who started this. We don't have any other choice, do we?" Shirone pressed her ear against the door, trying to listen to what was going on inside. She heard the man's voice. "Don't you need to change clothes?" Inside, Sina responded, "I still prefer the outfit I'm wearing today." Sina continued, "Maybe I should change after all." Then the man decided to compliment her. "You look beautiful." Aruki and Shirone, overhearing this, turned red and awkwardly said, "I think we should stop listening." Sina's voice came again from inside. "When will your wife be back?" The man answered, "Probably in about 2 hours." The three of them were stunned and confused. Is the professor really dating someone who's already married? Inside, the man quickly took charge of the situation. "Great, let's get down to business." Aruki commented, "This is way worse than a weakness." Need, shocked by what she just heard, quickly grabbed the doorknob and decided to act. "We have to stop this from happening." Three of them rushed into the room, tears streaming down their faces, trying to prevent something terrible from happening. "Professor, please don't do this," they all said in unison, then their voices faded. "It's wrong," they added. The three of them were stunned by the scene before them. The door, unable to withstand the pressure from all three, had fallen off. The sight of the man sitting there, painting, left them confused. "Painting?" Saina stammered. "You kids." The sudden appearance of the students in the situation they walked into made her so embarrassed that she got angry and shouted, "What are you doing here?" Immediately, all three of them were ordered to raise their hands, their arms trembling, unsure of how long they'd been in the air. Need, who was at the front, spoke up to apologize. "I'm sorry," he said. "We thought she was doing something for adults." He continued, "We thought you were doing something inappropriate." Saina was caught off guard by Need's excuse. "What? You really think I would do something like that?" She was furious and snapped, "Go back to school and you'll see what happens. Understand?" Aruki sighed in frustration. There had to be some kind of punishment. He quickly dragged Need, the ringleader, in front of the weapon. "He was the one who planned this," Aruki said. Shirone, standing to the side, quickly provided evidence. The invisibility cloak belongs to Need. Need, caught in the middle, couldn't react in time to the sudden betrayal from his friends. "You traitors," he said. "You didn't even protest." The man with long hair quickly stepped in to rescue the three of them. "Don't scold them anymore, I'm fine, and the door's been fixed." Sana still felt guilty about him, but he spoke up to explain, "Your students just followed you because they were worried about you. Right, Sana?" He gave a light smile and gestured to show it was fine. Even though they had followed him, it was really because she had been careless and had broken into someone else's house. It was clear that the kids hadn't thought things through, but they rushed in because their teacher was here. He slowly walked toward the outside and said, "I'll go make some tea. You all talk for a bit." The Shirone group quickly responded, "Thank you." The three of them looked at him with admiration. He really is an angel. Watching his slow movements, Shirone began to wonder and quietly asked herself, "Is he blind?" Suddenly, a shift in her mind made her clutch her head, thinking, "But why does my head feel so heavy all of a sudden? Could this be related to the feeling of sympathy?" Sana helplessly raised her hand to her forehead and said, "I'm just glad Armen is such a generous person." Shirone immediately asked about it. "Professor," he politely asked, "who is that?" Need supported one side and couldn't hide her curiosity. "Right, what's your relationship with him? Why do you have to be so careful when you visit him?" Sana rubbed her temples, still having to answer, "Armen is a senior who attended the Magic Academy with me when we were younger." Aruki asked, "So he's a wizard too, but why did he lose his sight?" Sana let out a sudden sigh, pausing before speaking. "Armen." Her voice dropped, the atmosphere grew heavier. "He lost his sight because of me." Sana remembered that day. She had been running in the pouring rain. When she was younger, she had pushed herself too hard. She could still picture herself crying loudly in the rain, her sobs blending with the story she was telling. During that terrible day, the only thing she could do was run away. Armen. He had been a young boy, running fast and shouting, "Sana, be careful, the water's rising over there." Sana, stubborn as ever, tried to escape from Armen. "No, don't come near me." In that moment, she lost her footing. Sana was swept away by the rushing water, her screams blending with Armen's desperate calls from above. "Sana!" Without hesitation, Armen jumped into the water after her. They both grabbed onto a large piece of wood. Terrified, Sana cried out. Armen immediately tried to calm her. "Hold on. If we can just hang on until we reach the lower river, we'll be saved." Armen suddenly saw what lay ahead. A massive pile of wooden trunks stacked on top of each other, with branches of all sizes sticking out dangerously. He quickly turned to Sana and gave her instructions. "Sana, we have to dive down. You can do it, right?" Sana, tears still streaming down her face, replied in fear, I can't. With little time left, Armen pushed Sana's head down into the water, constantly reassuring her. "Hold your breath. I'll keep you submerged so you won't float back up. If we hold on tight, we'll survive." Sana nodded obediently, her voice soft. "Okay." Armen was left alone above, facing the large logs ahead, but a sudden surge of hope filled him. "Yes, we will survive." The speed was increasing and the logs charged straight toward the pile, while his thoughts raced, "At least you have to survive." Tears fell from Armen's eyes as he waited for whatever would come next for the two of them. Sana bitterly recalled that moment. The genius of the Magic Academy, Armen had lost his eyesight like that. He had given up his dream of becoming a mage, even though both of them had survived. Everyone around them looked at Armen with sympathy after hearing his story. Sana continued, "When I heard he became a painter, you can't imagine how shocked I was." She spoke softly, adding, "So, that's how it turned out?" Aruki understood then. "So, you were really worried about overloading him." At that moment, Arden walked in and broke the heavy silence with his voice. "Sana sure complains a lot, doesn't she?" Sana, caught off guard, responded, "Armen." Shirone quickly chimed in, expressing her gratitude. "Thank you, sir." Armen continued, "But even though she complains, Sana definitely cares a lot about those kids. She talks about her students all the time." Needy, looking a bit embarrassed, scratched his head and said, "We really respect her too." Aruki, sipping his tea, casually added, "It's iced tea." Shiro moved closer to the painting Armen was working on and asked, "If it's not too much trouble, could we watch you paint?" This surprised Armen a little. "You want to watch me paint? I'd like to see too." Aruki then asked curiously, "How do you paint if you can't see?" Sana noticed her students were being a bit too blunt and quickly intervened. "Don't be so rude, you guys." Armen gently reassured Sana, "I'm fine. There's not much time left. I need to keep painting." Sana, "You're okay with that, right?" Sana, not bothered at all, immediately agreed, "Of course." Though a little shy, Sana posed for Armen, preparing to be painted. By now, Armen had almost finished sketching his painting. Neve stood off to the side, constantly marveling at Armen's skill. "It's unbelievable. I wonder how he does it." Aruki thought for a moment and said he definitely must be using his domain. Need turned to discuss it. So, that means he has to be a wizard at the very least. Meanwhile, Shirone quietly observed every movement Armen made. He slowly stood up and cautiously said, "Uncle Armen." Shirone asked a question that made Armen stop what he was doing. "You can see it, right?" Armen immediately smiled and turned to look at Shirone. He slowly removed the cloth covering his eyes and said, "I've been looking forward to this kid." I wondered if Shirone. Shirone stood in shock, staring at the scene in front of him. Armen, with his glowing eyes, looked back at him and said, "Did you notice it?" Armen's eyes were bright, and as he pulled the white cloth away, he moved closer to Shirone, making Shirone even more excited. I'm waiting to see when Shirone figures it out. Shirone repeatedly tapped Need's head, but didn't get a response. "Need, Aruki, come look at this." Armen's eyes. He turned around and was surprised to see his two friends standing still. Sana was also frozen in place, sitting silently. Shirone checked each person, his eyes wide. Wait a second. Armen spoke up from behind, explaining, "It's magic." The golden light around Armen grew brighter, adding to his presence. This technique is called stilled reading. Shirone couldn't believe his eyes. He exclaimed, "No way." He thought to himself, never expecting to meet a wizard who had reached the level of being able to wield time magic at the speed of light. Armen calmly invited Shirone to sit down. "Sit down. Take it easy. We have plenty of time to talk," he said. At that moment, Armen's room seemed to split into thousands of smaller rooms, creating an endless maze. Shirone still couldn't believe what he was seeing, his mouth hanging open in a dumbfounded grin. Armen sat in the chair across from him and calmly said, "Honestly, I've always been worried. I knew you'd figure it out sooner or later." Shirone was surprised and asked, "You knew I'd figure it out?" Armen pointed to the white cloth wrapped around his eyes and explained, "People take in light through their eyes and then recreate it as an image in their minds. But my eyes themselves are light." He continued, "As soon as I saw you, I knew we shared something in common." Shirone hesitated, thinking it over. Could it be? Armen immediately confirmed, "Exactly." He smiled gently and revealed the ability to be immortal. Shirone was just as shocked. He cautiously asked Armen, "Can I ask about the immortality ability?" Armen didn't hesitate to explain. The ability to achieve immortality is the gateway to reincarnation, and those who open this gate are called unlockers. The light from Armen's eyes shone through the white cloth. Before Shirone, a lock appeared, suddenly unlocked, surrounded by a golden aura of power. "Shirone, you've opened that gate," Armen said. Along with Armen's explanation, a stream of emerald light and its powerful circle appeared. The mind of the unlocker flows into infinity, and from there, they experience great strength and liberation. Shirone listened carefully to every word. Noticing the tension on his face, Armen reassured him, "Don't worry, as long as you don't cross the limit, your mind will remain intact." Shirone quickly replied, "It's all right, actually. I've been dreaming about the universe every night." Armen was surprised by this information. "The universe?" Armen asked. Shirone expressed his concern. "Yes, I've kept it from my friends, but with these supernatural feelings, it felt like I was losing my mind." He hesitated before continuing, "And it seems like there's some danger too." Armen smiled and spoke to Shirone. "I understand now. It seems that..." He gave Shirone some positive news. "Magic has taken a liking to you, Shirone." This left Shirone feeling a bit confused. Armen continued to explain, "First of all, the symptoms you're experiencing are unavoidable." The image of Shirone floating in the vastness of space, surrounded by thousands of stars, appeared alongside Armen's detailed explanation. "The place you're touching is the infinite realm, the universe itself. Anyone who faces reincarnation and a space as overwhelming as this would feel fear. A trigger like fear will lead to enlightenment." Armen then mimicked the image of Shirone unlocking the universe. Most people who unlock it gain space-time omnipotence. But for you, Shirone, the fear you're feeling has nothing to do with space. You've encountered something entirely different. Armen gently reassured Shirone once again, "The moment you realize what it is, your worries will disappear." Hearing this, Shirone immediately perked up. "How will I know what it is?" Armen smiled and replied, "You'll figure it out. I don't know when though, maybe soon, or it could take a lifetime to realize." This made Shirone's mood drop a bit. "A lifetime?" Armen reassured him again. "Don't worry." The image of Shirone's cosmic soul reflected behind Armen as he spoke. "It's already inside you. You just haven't named it yet." Shirone thought about the statement for a moment, then asked, "Is it something that hasn't been discovered yet? The universe exists, but it's inside me. I don't really understand." Shirone then shared something that surprised Armen. "Could it be related to the light and the threads I dreamed about?" It seemed like Armen realized something and smiled, continuing, "Maybe it's connected to gauge symmetry theory." Shirone's eyes lit up as she was introduced to a new concept, gauge symmetry theory. Armen went on to explain scholars believe this world is perfect, under the influence of supernatural forces of the universe, and with my detailed explanations, people believe in a perfect physical law, a world that can be explained through math. Just like the speed of light being constant, this ideal symmetry seems like something someone intentionally crafted with great care. But Armen paused. Over time, as the world has changed, the forces affecting humanity have quickly drifted away from their original path. Yet the more we study, the more we realize that this symmetry has been broken. Shirone turned to observe Aruki, lost in thought. Come to think of it, Aruki once told me about the mysterious world of probabilities. Armen continued, the universe we live in is not perfect. We can't know what broke that symmetry. He concluded that it was an unnamed existence. But if it were you, Shirone, you'd figure it out. Shirone heard Armen's encouraging words and awkwardly replied, thank you, uncle. He seemed to have realized a lot and happily told Armen, thank you so much. Uncle Armen, I think I can do it. Chiron hesitated, expressing his regret about following the professor, but added, but I'm really glad I got to meet you. Armen turned to look at Sina and said, take care of Sina, okay? He gently told Chiron, she's more sensitive than you think. At that moment, Chiron suddenly remembered and quickly asked, why did you hide your ability? You could have told her. Armen bent down slightly and explained, Sina always worries about me because she feels guilty, but it took a long time for my eyes to heal. I didn't want her to waste her time on me. A brief thought crossed his mind. I'm already married. Armen returned to his seat and continued drawing. Chiron kept observing. As Armen drew, he reflected on what he had just said. I want to help Sina live her own life. Sina sat still, posing for Armen's painting. Her cheeks were flushed, looking just like the princesses in old stories. Chiron sat quietly, thinking about their conversation, while Nin and Aruki chatted excitedly next to the table. Chiron remembered Armen's advice and smiled, as if agreeing with it. So promise me, keep this secret, okay? The painting of Sina in a yellow dress like autumn leaves was complete. Armen expressed his gratitude to Sina. Thank you, Sina. Sina humbly replied, it's nothing. We're close like family. She softly added, today's the last day. Once you're settled somewhere else, I'll write to you. Armen immediately agreed without hesitation. Yeah, I'll reply. Then he turned to Shirone and reminded her to study hard with Aruki and the others. The three of them happily responded in unison. Thank you so much, uncle. Armen smiled and said, Sina, I'll see you later. Sina, still feeling a little reluctant, said goodbye. Well, I'm going now. Just then, a bright voice rang out from a distance. My love, I'm back from shopping. Have you finished the drawing? The four of them stood still, looking ahead, where Armen's wife appeared, calling out warmly, oh my, Miss Sina, are you leaving already? Stay and have a meal with us. Shirone was taken aback by Armen's wife's appearance. Uncle Armen has some unique tastes, she thought. She bent down to examine Sina's face and assessed, why is her face so red? Darling, Miss Sina doesn't look well. Sina was speechless, unable to say anything. My classmates and I quickly made our exit to avoid the awkward atmosphere. Sorry, we're in a rush, so we'll leave now. Armen barely had time to say quick goodbye. Take care, Sina. The red-haired girl behind them watched everything unfold. Then, in a mocking tone, she said to Armen, I wonder if your superiors believe this, Armen. Does your clear-sightedness really show such an expression? Armen coldly replied, stop the nonsense and report already. She quickly got to the point, we need to leave Kreese. There are plenty of flies and mosquitoes on the road to Kelbera, but what does that matter compared to your clear-sightedness, Armen? Then she said sarcastically, wait, I should call you the one who seeks the souls of the eternal realm, shouldn't I? Armen silently walked into the house and said, I'll do as agreed, so stop talking nonsense. She then asked, you still haven't told Sina, have you? Seeing Armen remain silent, she reminded him, don't forget, the lives of those you care about are at risk. Armen coldly responded, striking her with a sharp reply, don't worry, Sina doesn't know anything. Sina walked silently ahead, not saying a word, so the others behind her spoke up, worried. This is bad. Shirone turned to ask why, and Mead explained. At this rate, Sina's mood is really bad. When we get back to the academy, we'll be punished for stalking and breaking in. The research group will be disbanded. He suddenly called out to Sina, making her stop and look back. Professor Sina, Need stepped forward, using his usual playful tone as he asked, could we grab a bite before we head back? Aruki immediately joined in, yeah, we're starving. Shirone smiled warmly and added, we don't get to go out often, so we should definitely eat something, right, Professor? Seeing her three students so pitiful, Sina's heart softened, and she said, I guess so. You're all really hungry, so you haven't been yourselves all day. She quickly agreed and turned to walk ahead. All right, let's go. We'll eat until we're stuffed. The three behind her, now having gotten what they wanted, cheered in unison. Nice. Need focused on his ultimate goal, getting Saina's spirits up to avoid punishment, while Aruki had his eye on a delicious dinner. I'm going to order something really expensive. But it was Shirone who was most concerned about Saina's feelings. She's sad because she has to leave Mr. Armen. We should try to cheer her up. It was getting late in a shop in the city. Saina's voice rang out, give me more. Then came the frantic voices. Professor, I was wrong. Please stop, ma'am. Saina's face was flushed from the alcohol as she lifted the bottle and loudly said, another bottle, please. The students beneath her begged in fear. Please don't drink any more, ma'am. An unsolved mystery. What happened to Saina? 2 hours earlier, when 3 students were nervously begging her, the table was already set with beautifully arranged, delicious-looking food. Needs saw Saina pour wine into a glass, and one student asked, Professor, are you planning to drink? Saina casually picked up her glass, speaking sarcastically to her students. So what? You guys can sneak into strangers' houses, but I can't have a drink. Need quickly smiled and said, Of course not, today's your day off. Feel free to drink. Shirone, sitting beside the table, eagerly enjoyed each dish, constantly exclaiming, This is so good. Aruki, laughing at Shirone's innocence, looked like it was the first time he had tasted this dish. Need, trying to win Saina's favor, quickly poured more wine for her. Let me pour for you, ma'am. She swiftly pulled the bottle away and shooed her student. You're just a kid. Why are you messing with this stuff? Need smiled, but inside he was already planning his next move. However, he had to make sure the professor stayed in a good mood. If he remained mysterious with his plan, he'd be able to win her over. Behind him, Shiro happily shared her food with Aruki. Aruki, try this dish too. Aruki quickly declined. No thanks, I'm tired of it. Need, looking proud of his strategy, grinned deviously. I'm sure I'll find her weakness. About an hour later, Need cried out in pain as Saina pinched his round cheek, saying, You troublesome kid. She playfully teased him, squeezing his cheeks. Why do your cheeks always look so chubby? Shirone and Aruki, sitting across from them, started to feel nervous. She's drunk, they both thought. Suddenly, Saina turned toward them, making both of them jump. You two are really good at fast shooting, she said, still holding Need's cheek with one hand and pointing at them with the other, speaking in a loud voice. Both of you are so talented. Why do you slack off at school? Her tone softened a bit and Saina wiped away a tear. Her voice choked as she said, Even with all your talent, so many still don't reach their dreams. You might think I'm a bad professor, but what about you two? Shirone quickly spoke up to clarify, No, we don't think that at all. Saina's face was flushed from the alcohol, but there was also an undeniable sadness in her expression. It seemed like she lost her balance and collapsed straight onto the dining table. She laid her face down on the table, motionless, causing her students to panic and call out loudly. Professor. Aruki, casually picking his teeth, said, I'm done eating. The three of them stared at their professor, thinking the same thing. She's still not awake. Need, still chewing his food, looked at their teacher with concern. What do we do now? She hasn't even paid yet. Seriously. Shirone rushed over to shake Saina, trying to wake her up. Professor, wake up, please, Professor. Just then, a man's voice rang out, dripping with a sly, mocking tone. Oh no, this young lady seems really drunk. Should I take her home in my carriage? Of course, she's just a lady, so I should politely decline. There's no need. The group of men, who clearly weren't bothered, moved closer to Saina's seat. One of them said, Hey, kids shouldn't interfere. Let the adults handle this. Hurry, help her out. He reached his hand towards Saina. Up close, she really was beautiful. His eyes gleamed as he muttered, Impressive. Just as he was about to touch Saina, Shirone grabbed his wrist, his voice cold. Why did you let go? Shirone's gaze was steady as he stared at the two strange men. Don't touch our professor. Both men were taken aback by Shirone's attitude. One of them raised his voice and yelled, How dare this kid? If you're students, what are you doing here at night? You should be at home, sleeping with your mothers. Shirone stood there without changing expression as the man continued. One word from me and you'll all be expelled. Suddenly, a beam of electric light appeared out of nowhere, causing the man to scream in terror, his eyes nearly popping out of his head. Need, standing to the side, cast a spell and threatened. I think you should quietly leave unless you want to embarrass yourself. One of the men quickly realized what was happening and hesitantly said, It's magic. The other man started to panic, muttering, Don't tell me they're from the Althea's Magic Academy. He thought to himself, This is beyond my authority. Then a voice suddenly spoke up, Administrative Official Kree's Douglas Silver. The man turned around and saw his wallet in Aruki's hand. My wallet, when did you take it? Aruki, calmly inspecting the contents, asked, Are you a person of authority? He tossed the wallet back at its owner, then smiled and said, If you want to expel these people, come find Mercadine and Aruki. I'll be staying with them. The wallet hit the dumbfounded man square in the face. So shocked, he stammered, Mercadine. The image of a powerful man with immense strength and an impressive background left the two men in awe. A top-tier noble, part of a family that's been royal advisors for 3 generations, was that Mercadine? The two of them quickly panicked and fled. We should have never gotten involved with them from the start. And what's the point of showing off so much power? Need watched them run and turning to Aruki, asked curiously, why did you mention the family? I thought you didn't like them. Aruki explained, aside from those assholes who only care about connections, let's go. It's not worth being in a bad mood after enjoying such a good meal. Meanwhile, Sena was still peacefully asleep, smiling in the back. Need quickly snapped a picture, feeling excited. He held the photo in his hands and turned around, grinning like he just hit the jackpot. Look at this, someone who's a perfectionist, drunk and nodding off. This is priceless. Aruki, holding the camera, complimented Need's photography skills. You can actually take decent photos. Need, feeling proud of his catch, replied, our group is finally safe from falling apart. Shirone, drenched in sweat, whispered, you guides. At that moment, Sena was lying motionless on Shirone's back like a heavy, lifeless lump. Why do I have to carry Sena? Shirone muttered. Need joked, what's wrong? Jealous? Aruki quickly reassured him, you're the strongest out of the 3 of us. The image of helplessness as Need carried Sena on his back was clear. Need muttered under his breath, I'm going to die. Aruki, even weaker than him, couldn't even take a step before collapsing. Aruki walked over to Shirone and whispered a small tip to him. Try using the map. Shirone looked confused. Hey, you just use it whenever you want. Aruki explained. You can only use the map if you can use your magic field. Need suddenly turned around as if remembering something. Right, there are also the magic swordsmen in the kingdom. Aruki encouraged Shirone. I know you've got the talent. Hearing that, Shirone's eyes immediately lit up. Really? I want to learn. Aruki quickly gave him instructions. First, close your eyes and focus on yourself. He gently guided him. Shirone, I'll ask you some leading questions, so just follow my voice. Shirone took it seriously and followed his instructions. He gradually sank into the deep well of his soul, focusing on feeling his true self, then reflecting deeply on who he was. In the quiet space of his mind, Shirone heard Aruki's voice. Can you hear me? He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. Aruki stood behind Shirone, his tone mysterious as he said, listen carefully and answer me. Where did you have your first kiss with Senior Amy? Shirone opened her eyes helplessly at the prank played by her 2 friends. Need burst into loud laughter, saying, ha, that's hilarious. Shirone got tricked. The deep, dark sky and the crescent moon cast a beautiful blanket of stars above them. The 3 of them had just crossed the bridge when Shirone spoke up. Hey, stop using the professor's weaknesses to get what you want. Need looked displeased. Why not? We worked really hard to get that. Shirone spoke softly. You know why, Professor Sena. Today, she must have had a long, tiring, and sad day. Sena was peacefully asleep on Shirone's back. Aruki spoke up. Professor Sena, she just hopes we won't have to go through the pain she once felt. Need fell silent, avoiding the gazes of his 2 friends. After thinking for a moment, he made up his mind. All right, but the foreigner president handed the group over to me. If we fall apart, then I... Need seemed frustrated as he made the decision. He threw the photo into the river below, watching it quickly dissolve into the current. Forget it. Things will work out. The 3 of them turned to face each other, making a silent vow. Yeah, let's just do what we can. Perfect. Suddenly, Sena jumped up, startling the students. What do you mean perfect? Shirone awkwardly asked, Professor, are you awake? Sena quickly replied, sorry to troll you all, I apologize. She quickly put on her jacket and calmly said, I will keep your secret. The 3 of them were surprised and asked in unison, what? Seeing that her students didn't understand, Sena explained, what I mean is, I won't punish you. Guide. The 3 of them were stunned and replied together, really? Then Sena pointed at them and said, and I'm giving you 1 month. With the tone of a professor assigning homework, she added, show me something supernatural or whatever. If you truly care about your research group, then use that confidence to convince the academy. Sena said earnestly, what I'm saying is, you all need to achieve what you want. In response to her passionate words, Shirone seemed to sense something and softly said, Professor. Need, standing nearby, responded with excitement, yes. He stood determined in front of the professor, saying, whether we present it or not, we will prove the value of our research group with confidence and pride. Aruki, also excited, added, we'll have to use our intellect, right? Sena encouraged them, go for it, you troublesome students. Need eagerly replied, don't be too amazed then. Standing in front of this scene, Shirone smiled contentedly, thinking, Nothing has changed. He smiled happily, but I felt a wave of relief. The four of us then casually walked across the bridge. At that moment, the students began to ask Sena, Professor, when did you wake up? How can a mage pass out from just a few drops of alcohol? This caught Sena off guard. What? Wait a second. A few days later, at the academy, under the clear blue sky with fluffy white clouds, whispers began spreading inside the school. What's this? A research presentation. A large poster was pinned to the bulletin board, attracting the attention of many students passing by. Since when did Senior Shirone join this group? And Senior Aruki too. Everyone seemed puzzled by the name of the research group, but what exactly is spiritual science research? The poster was printed in gray with mysterious images related to the topic and a striking headline that caught the reader's eye. Spiritual Science Research Group, the terrifying truth about Althea's Magic Academy. Outside the castle, voices asked, Senior Shirone and Aruki are involved too. But wait, is this really an academic presentation? The scene shifted back in time to 10 days ago at a place called Ista's. Need, pulling his hair in frustration, shouted, I can't think of anything. He leaned back into the couch and sighed. The table was covered with a mess of topic cards. On the couch across from him, Aruki was also sighing, while Shirone, sitting in the chair next to him, was slouched, unsure of what to do. Aruki reached up to touch his nose and said, no matter how long we stay up talking, looking at all these topics on the table, goblins, zombies, exorcisms, spiritualism, extrasensory perception, ghosts, gods, possession, telepathy, aliens, spirits, Ouija boards, the afterlife, out-of-body experiences, ghost stories, doppelgangers. He paused and continued, there just aren't many interesting topics here. Need glanced at the cards in his hand. One side had ghosts, goblins, and exorcisms. The other side had out-of-body experiences and extrasensory perception, spirits. Need, looking confused, said, even if any of this stuff is real, we can't exactly demonstrate it during the presentation. The topic cards scattered across the table, reflecting their collective confusion and helplessness. It had been 3 days since they promised Professor Sena, confidently declaring that their presentation would win, but now they were researching the science of the supernatural. Need remembered the moment when the professor had pointed at them and said, show me a ghost or something. Shirone sighed in frustration, thinking, how are we supposed to show something that can't even be seen with the naked eye? Thanks to that, the soul is completely insane. That's why Need starts throwing a bunch of pictures around and then wonders, why did I even throw these away? Aruki says, well, I've been crazy for a while, so it's nothing new. Meanwhile, our main character, Shirone, stretches and yawns before saying, I can't do this anymore. Then he adds, anyway, about this. At that moment, he glances over, then freezes. He lets out a loud scream when he sees the image of a transparent figure staring at him and smiling. Shirone is sitting in a chair, but he falls backward onto the floor. Standing behind the chair, the figure of a laughing shadow says, how's that? Or should we trick them into thinking this is a ghost? Aruki, still lounging with his feet up on the chair, casually replies, that's just a lightning shadow. Shirone quickly lifts the chair up, turns around, and says in a panic, it's staring at me. That's why I'm scared. Aruki sighs and gives him a quick glance, saying a mage isn't going to fall for something like that. Need innocently asks, huh? But it fooled Shirone. Aruki questions, if it only fooled him for 2 seconds, does that even count as being tricked? At this, Shirone gets antsy. He immediately stands up, clenches his fists, and shouts, no need to check it. He repeats firmly, we don't need to check it. Need laughs and says, right, so let's go find Professor Sena's weakness. Aruki, thoughtfully stroking his chin, says, actually, I think he might have a good idea about this. Shirone explained to Need, it's not that I'm scared because I was tricked. It's a fear deep inside me that's been triggered. Need, surprised, asked, can you explain that a little more? Shirone spoke seriously. Instead of making them believe by presenting evidence, will bring out their hidden fear. Aruki, starting to understand, said with interest, so what you're saying is we should change our approach. Instead of proving something to make them believe, we'll make them believe first and then prove it. Shirone nodded exactly. It's a kind of mental puzzle. Need grabbed Shirone's face and shook it, shouting, wow, you're the one who's going to save our group. Shirone, annoyed, shouted back, you haven't showered in 3 days. Aruki, resting his chin on his hand, said, that's a clever reversal of the concept. Aruki pointed at Need's shadow and said, the problem is if we show a magic trick like this, the superstitious people probably won't even believe it. Can you make it look scarier? Need, who had been pushed away by Shirone, immediately responded, of course I can. He began using both hands to cast a spell and said, if I keep using lightning shadows like this. Need yelled out, check this out. A series of shadows, all with the same expression as him, appeared at once. Need danced and sang, if I use 24 frames per second, I could create a much smoother animation. The two of them watched as Need, who hadn't slept in 3 days, continued bouncing around. Shirone held his forehead, turned away, and said, "We can't use this method." Aruki, on the other hand, asked, "What if we built a machine?" Need stopped, scratched his head, and awkwardly replied, "I thought of that, but there's a problem." He explained, demonstrating, "I could upload the program into a machine and move the projection. For example, if someone enters a forest and unexpectedly encounters a ghost, their reaction would be immediate. They'd jump and scream, 'Ah, it's a ghost.' But if someone doesn't react, they wouldn't be fooled. Instead, they'd stay calm and think, 'What's this? It's just a trick.'" Shirone thought for a moment. He realized Need was right. He'd been so shocked because Need had looked straight at him. At that moment, a hand shot up with a voice saying, "Oh, that's Aruki." Aruki spoke confidently, "I think I can solve that problem." The other two were taken aback and asked, "You can do it." Aruki nodded and pointed upward. "If we predict their reactions, we can do it. We'll use the theory of complex systems." Chiron repeated, "Predict their reactions. Go on." To illustrate his point, Aruki showed an image of Chiron's daily routine. Aruki continued, "After analyzing most of the reaction habits, we will program it. Let me give you an example. After predicting that Chiron will look to the left, a spirit on the left will look toward him. At that point, if Chiron gets scared and runs, 2 options will be given: chase him and continue staring." Hearing this, Chiron is surprised and exclaims, "Can you really do that?" Aruki continues, "Everyone at the academy has the same habits, so we can make it work, but we'll need a lot of data." He keeps explaining, "We'll also need a lot of memory, but more importantly, we need a way to send the whole program to all the machines." Need thinks for a moment and says, "My lightning energy won't be enough." Suddenly, as if realizing something, Need says, "Wait, Chiron, you can use your luminary magic, right?" Chiron is taken aback and answers, "I can use luminary magic." Remembering what the professor had said in the Ivory Tower, where the latest magic is studied, luminary magic was predicted to revolutionize how we exchange information. Chiron nods with excitement and says, "That's right. Professor Sina said it would be used as an intermediary to exchange information." Chiron becomes more enthusiastic. "Yes, we can do this." At this point, Aruki spoke up again, saying, "We can create the perfect ghost, but I don't think just scaring them with a ghost will be enough." He turned to Chiron and asked, "You have a different plan, right, Chiron?" Chiron replied, "Yeah, but I think..." He furrowed his brow. "For example, I was thinking of using this psychological trick." With that, Chiron picked up a pen and started writing on a piece of paper. Aruki and Need both leaned in, curious. Chiron looked up, confused, and asked, "What's wrong? Is it that useful? If it doesn't work, we can always add another keyword." Need, still looking down at the paper, said, "No." He was certain of it. This made Chiron ask again, "Really?" Need confirmed, "I don't even think we can use it like that in the presentation." At this moment, Aruki said, "If it works, I guarantee the whole academy will be turned upside down. A total 180-degree change." Chiron got excited. "Really? That's amazing." Need grinned that it's settled. Need assigned tasks. "I'll go work on the machine right away. Aruki will write the program, and Chiron will prepare the self-luminous display." Chiron and Need were both excited. "This is great. We can save the team." Aruki became thoughtful and said, "But do you guys know?" Need jumped and asked, "Ha, what now?" Aruki said seriously, "I'm estimating the necessary amount of self-illumination required to transmit the data." Chiron asked, "How much do we need?" Aruki held up both hands, saying, 3 times the amount we currently have, and you need to maintain it for 10 minutes. He turned to Chiron and asked, "What do you think? Is it possible?" Chiron and Need's faces changed instantly. Chiron stuttered, 10 minutes? Need looked completely confused. 10 days later at Ista's, Need, looking anxious, pushed open the door and called out, "Hey, you two." I went and put up some posters. And, oh my god. Inside the room, Aruki had been working on the action routine equations all day. He looked up. Meanwhile, Cherelle had been practicing self-illumination all day, turned around and asked, "What's going on?" Need said, "It's causing a huge stir. Everyone's saying they're coming to check it out." He wiped the sweat off his face after seeing the poster, then added, "We've got to make sure we go see it." Aruki asked suspiciously, "Oh no, do you think it's because we put our names on it? This could get messy. Too many people come, the workload will increase. How many people do you think will show up?" Shirone, looking extremely happy, said, "I'm not sure, but probably more than half the academy." Outside, a voice shouted, "Aruki." Shirone calmed down and said, "There are about 17 days until a presentation by the Supernatural Soul Science Research Team." Someone was walking down the hall. A girl with purple hair was strolling when she overheard people talking around her. "You think it's going to be a lot of fun, right?" Yeah, who would have guessed that both Senior Shirone and Aruki would be giving presentations? I'm sure that presentation won't be anything ordinary. I wonder what they'll show us. All the chatter from the people around her filled her ears. As she walked, she crossed paths with someone standing between the buildings. Out of nowhere, a figure in the shadows spoke, their face hidden. Is it true that the supernatural soul brute will be presenting something? She replied. We haven't decided yet if the group will be able to pull it off. She turned toward the figure in the shadows and continued. According to my sources, if the presentation fails, the academy will take back the research room. The person in the shadows responded. Of course, that group is done for. Its glorious past is long gone. Another person with short hair, also hidden in the dark corner, said, but we still don't know. The group has Aruki, who has Seventh Syndrome, and Chiron, who defeated the Dark Sorcerer. We can't underestimate Need's abilities. The first person scoffed and said, they're still just low-level students. What we should really worry about is what happens after that. The girl kept walking forward, signaling that the battle for the shadowy research route to become the second Masters of Istas had begun. In a dark, pitch-black room, the sound of teeth grinding echoed. Suddenly, the bricks on the wall shifted on their own, and light from the outside began to creep in, illuminating the once gloomy room. In the dim light, Chiron's handsome face was tense with strain. He clenched his teeth and furrowed his brow, fully focused on a technique that would help him recover. Both hands stretched out in front of him, releasing a powerful surge of energy as his magical force flowed from his palms. After a while, sweat began to form on his hands. It seemed like he was getting exhausted. He collapsed onto the floor, his face clearly showing signs of fatigue. Shirone thought back to what this was called mental recovery. It's an extreme method used to quickly boost magical output when mental energy has reached its limit. It would take about 20 minutes to recover, during which time you keep pushing yourself until you hit your limit. The average mental energy required for each spell is a sustained focus over 40 minutes, which is why this method is considered reckless and can kill the user. As he thought about this, Shirone glanced at the pocket watch in his hand. He silently thought if the professor found out, he wouldn't let this slide. The stopwatch read 5 minutes and 32 seconds. Shirone felt a bit discouraged. This is bad. The whole point of pushing my mental limits like this is so I can use my light-based spell within 5 minutes. He frowned, knowing that his presentation was just 7 days away. I have no choice but to push through and reach 10 minutes, he thought, resolving to keep going until his consciousness completely shattered. Shirone was lost in thought, wondering, can I really do this? Just then, Need poked his head into the room and looked at Shirone. He asked with concern, Shirone, are you okay? Startled by the sudden question, Shirone jumped. He quickly replied, of course, I'll finish it before the deadline. Need looked down, his eyes welling up with tears, and whispered, it's so hard. The goal feels so far away. It's beyond what the 5th grade can handle. But if you fail, Need couldn't finish his sentence because both of them knew how disastrous the outcome would be for the whole group. Chiron understood what Need meant. He immediately reassured him. I told you, don't worry. Chiron skillfully changed the subject. How about you? Are you done with your part? Need snapped back to reality and remembered. Right, I was just about to go back and test it again. Chiron followed Need into another room. As soon as he entered, he stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in shock at the sight of Aruki, who had dark circles under his eyes and was frantically writing his paper. Chiron gasped, Aruki, are you okay? He rushed over, slapping his hand on Aruki's shoulder. Are you really okay? Aruki didn't stop writing. His eyes were wide open, almost mechanically as he replied, Ah, don't worry, I'll finish it before the deadline. Chiron was left speechless. He helplessly thought to himself that there was no way he could stop him. This is crazy. Need suddenly spoke up, cutting off his train of thought. Here it is. After seeing Need's work, Chiron couldn't help but be impressed. He eagerly asked Need, is this the prototype? Need laughed and explained, the final test will be with your own light magic. I need to check the performance of the light cables that Aruki's father sent us. Need guided Chiron through the experiment. Hold the crystal ball and use your magic on it. Chiron followed Need's instructions. He held the glass ball with both hands. Once he was ready, he signaled. Okay. Chiron closed his eyes to focus his mind on channeling his magic into the ball. In an instant, the ball began to glow with a dazzling light. The light from the ball traveled down a cable connected to it. Chiron, amazed and excited, explained, Oh, this is amazing. Need, standing beside him, grinned with squinted eyes. So, how's it feel? His voice carried a hint of pride. Not bad, right? Really not bad. Looking at the results before him, Chiron was sure that their team had succeeded halfway. In the days that followed, on a rainy night, hurried footsteps could be heard on the muddy ground. It was Need, who had just returned from outside. As he entered the house, he took a deep breath, feeling the chill, with a little bit of rainwater still on him. The first thing Need did when he got back was head straight to Shirone's room. He peeked inside and called out, "Shirone, it's almost time for the presentation. Are you ready?" The room was unusually quiet. Need called again, "Shirone." Suddenly, the pendulum clock that Shirone always used slid across the floor, stopping right at Need's feet. Need bent down to pick it up, and as he did, his pupils widened. He froze for a moment and then said, "Wait, Shirone." His voice couldn't hide the excitement. "Did you do it?" Shirone stepped out of the room. He had beads of sweat on his face, but he wore a bright, beaming smile. He gave Need a thumbs up and said excitedly, "Let's do this together." Before long, the presentation day arrived, and the entire paranormal research team gathered at the academy. Everyone was eagerly anticipating the big day. Laughter and chatter filled the air. "This is so exciting." The booths around were just as lively. "Who wants some food?" "Please wait in line." A female server, carrying a tray of drinks, greeted guests. "Here's the academy's famous peach juice." In front, a girl with pink hair was handing out flyers, constantly saying, "Please take a flyer." Amidst the excitement, the sound of heavy footsteps suddenly cut through the noise, followed by a rough, dry voice. "Ha! There's an event today." It was Slider Mark, the student who had been suspended for 2 months. He had clearly learned to express his displeasure, saying, "Why are there so many people here?" A girl with pink hair immediately walked up and handed him a flyer. "Please take this and wait in line," she said. Mark took it, awkwardly replying, "Thanks." Holding the flyer in his hand, Mark thought to himself, What kind of flyer is this? It looks like something a kid drew." Suddenly, he focused on a detail. Wait a minute. On the flyer, alongside the spooky images, there was a bold headline, "Paranormal Research Team, the terrifying truth behind Althea's Magic Academy. The secrets the school wants to hide will soon be revealed." The headline was intriguing, but what caught Mark's attention even more was the name Arian Chiron. He couldn't forget that name. He furrowed his brow in anger and thought, what kind of childish presentation is this? Who would even want to watch it? I thought he was a genius. Just then, Merlang Maria, who was also suspended for 2 months like Mark, popped her head over to look at the flyer in his hand. She excitedly exclaimed, "Oh, Senior Chiron, let's go check it out." Maria turned to tug at Mark's sleeve, speaking in a cheerful tone. "You're going too, right? Right? Come on." Seeing her excited face, Mark reluctantly said, "Of course. Maybe I'll learn something if I go." Before Mark could back out, Maria decisively pulled him along, shouting, "The line's this way." Maria and Mark had received special education from Thad while they were suspended. To be more specific, Mark had been stuck there and had to endure much more training than the others. While Maria pulled Mark along to watch Chiron's presentation, a group of girls gathered around, chatting excitedly. One of them, with chestnut-colored hair, pointed toward Amy in surprise and exclaimed, You guys, isn't that the senior class?" Her friend standing next to her with dark hair couldn't believe it at first and asked, stunned, "What? The senior class?" Another girl quickly jumped in. Where? Soon, all eyes were on Amy and Cherelle. The students eagerly shouted, "It's Senior Amy and Senior Cherelle." Curious whispers spread among the crowd. Why would the seniors come to watch a presentation from the advanced class? A quiet voice piped up, "Senior Shirone is her boyfriend." Immediately, everyone understood and burst into cheers. Amid the chatter, Cherelle cheerfully offered Amy a piece of cake, teasing her as she said, "Open wide." Amy, already embarrassed beyond belief, couldn't hold it in any longer. She shyly called out to Cherelle, "Why do we have to come watch a presentation from the advanced class?" Cherelle giggled and replied, "Oh my god, how long were you going to say that? It's because it's your boyfriend's presentation." She purposely emphasized the words, "your boyfriend." Amy, embarrassed, covered her face with her hands, secretly wishing she could disappear. This is so embarrassing. It's like getting hit with my own stick. Suddenly, all the students turned their attention to one direction. Someone exclaimed in shock, The senior from class 1 is here." Another person, equally surprised, asked, "Why would someone so rare show up?" Amy was momentarily confused. Who could it be that even a former outstanding student like her is being ignored? Cherelle pointed ahead and shouted, "Amy, over there." The person arriving was wearing the prestigious school badge on their black suit. The crowd behind them was completely stunned. They whispered to each other, "Why is Senior Fermi here? Don't tell me he's here to watch the presentation." The students were wide-eyed, astonished, and exclaimed, "That's not all. It's Senior Hershey from the sonar department, and Senior Raken, the so-called electric monster, Senior Richard from alchemy, and even Senior Caden." The students couldn't believe their eyes. They gasped in amazement. What on earth is going on? The appearance of these exceptional figures not only shocked the students, but even Cherelle was taken aback. "Why is class 1 here?" she asked in surprise. Amy, on the other hand, wasn't too surprised. She casually asked Cherelle, "What do you think they have in common?" Cherelle furrowed her brows and asked, "In common?" Amy looked at Cherelle and replied indifferently, "Yes, all of them." As far as Amy knew, there were rumors that they were all part of a mysterious research group called Gold Rune. At that moment in the presentation hall, all the students had already found their seats. Sena was carrying a tray of tea to offer to a teacher with snow-white hair. The teacher was so surprised that she stumbled over her words. Sena couldn't believe it and said, "What wind brought you here, Principal?" Principal Alpheus smiled kindly, waved at her, and explained, "The students have worked hard to prepare for this presentation, so of course I had to come." Sena immediately, though flustered, respectfully invited the principal to sit in the most honored seats. "Of course, please have a seat." Alpheus smiled and sat down next to the elderly teacher. Beneath his warm smile, he narrowed his sharp eyes and thought to himself, "Well, let's see what these kids have prepared for me." In front of the presentation hall, the seating area was now completely packed. A few people sighed, saying, "No more seats. Please don't push." Amy glanced around, quietly assessing the presentation. Then she spotted Mark and Maria sitting together. In the distance, she noticed Fermi's group. The front row, of course, was reserved for Alpheus, Sena, and the other respected teachers of the school. With all the influential figures present, Amy couldn't help but wonder, is there something I don't know? Soon after, the entire presentation hall went dark with only a spotlight shining on the center of the stage. The voice of the announcer rang out, "Ladies and gentlemen." On stage, Need, dressed in a sharp suit, took on the role of the host. Facing the audience, he formally introduced the presentation on spiritual science, asking for permission to begin. He raised his hand and declared the start. The ambitious presentation by the spiritual science research team had begun. But 30 minutes later, in stark contrast to everyone's expectations, there wasn't a single clap of applause. Instead, a storm of paper balls rained down along with loud curses from the audience below. Damn it. The students, one after another, crumpled paper into balls and threw them directly at the stage. They shouted in anger, "What was I even expecting from a 5th grader? Focus on studying. This is a waste of time. Is this supposed to be a presentation? I've been tricked." Amy seemed frozen in shock. Cherelle, sitting beside her, softly called her name. Amy. Above them, the technical staff adjusted the lights to focus on Mead. On the stage, Mead began his presentation. "Thank you all for being here today." He briefly introduced himself. "Today, I'll be your MC for this presentation. I'm the leader of the spiritual science research team we need." Through the speakers, Need's confident voice filled the room. "Today, our main topic is spirits." Mark, sitting in the audience, furrowed his brows and grumbled, "Spirits like souls or something." On the other hand, Maria, sitting next to him, gazed up at the stage with admiration. On stage, Need continued his presentation. "Some of you might feel scared, so please be careful while watching." As soon as Need finished speaking, all the lights on stage were turned on at once. Yellow, blue, and red lights mixed together, making the entire stage light up in a dazzling display. The audience erupted into an amazed, long ooh of surprise. Principal Alpheus smiled broadly and complimented them. "You students really prepared well, didn't you?" Miss Sena reluctantly replied, "Yes." In her mind, she couldn't help but think, "It looks amazing." A bit over the top, though. Then she quickly changed her thoughts. "I wonder what they plan to do next." On stage, a grand and impressive image of a school resembling a massive ancient castle appeared. Need held the microphone, speaking in a voice full of emotion. "Have you ever heard the story of how this school was built? It was 250 years ago." With that, Need snapped his fingers. Instantly, the screen behind him shifted to show an image of a long-forgotten village. Need looked up at the screen and continued. "This was once a small village of farmers. The scene on stage changed, and the peaceful village was suddenly overtaken by chaos and war." Need's voice remained calm and steady as he spoke. However, the entire continent was soon swept up in the famous Conquest War. He went on. The people there fled to the mountains for safety. Civilians, and of course, even soldiers who didn't want to fight, were no exception. When Need said this, the lights on the stage suddenly went out, and the entire auditorium was enveloped in darkness. The students sitting below were taken aback. Surprised, they looked up at the stage and instinctively whispered, "Ha! The lights?" Need's voice echoed again, but it was no longer calm and steady. This time it sounded dark and eerie. Non-human entities appeared. At that moment, a blood-curdling scream cut through Mead's narration. Some of the students who were easily frightened turned pale, their hair standing on end. They tried to calm themselves, telling themselves there was probably nothing scary about to jump out. On stage, the bloody footsteps of a heavily armored knight suddenly appeared. Need's voice grew deeper. The armored knight let out a horrific scream, flailing its arms, covered in blood, looking just like a zombie. According to Need, this knight was someone whose body had been taken over by evil spirits. The students who had been scared out of their wits earlier now burst out laughing. One guy even pointed at the armored knight, mocking. Isn't that Aruki? What's he doing there? On stage, Aruki staggered forward, moving awkwardly and groaning in pain. He looked terrifying, but also quite pitiful. However, the audience below was laughing uncontrollably. Cherelle was laughing so hard she could barely breathe. She commented, "This is hilarious." Amy, sitting next to her, frowned and said, "Wait a second, is this a lecture or a play?" On stage, the story continued with Neve leading the way. And then one night, the stage lights shifted to a cold, eerie blue. The once beautiful village was now enveloped in a quiet, desolate atmosphere. Need's voice suddenly echoed, filled with a sorrowful, pleading tone. "Olia, my love. Olia, where are you? Damn it. I came here to escape the war, but I lost you, the most precious person to me." At this point, Need clutched his heart tightly, his face twisted in unbearable pain. Below the audience, Maria sat, gripping her hands together, fully immersed in the play unfolding on stage. It seemed like he had lost his lover while fleeing. Mark, however, wasn't like Maria. He twisted his mouth in confusion and remarked, "What the hell is this? Isn't this supposed to be a presentation? When's the actual person coming out?" At that moment, the one Mark had been waiting for finally appeared. Chiron's voice rang out, nearly making him choke on his own spit. "No, I'm here." At Chiron's call, the entire audience's attention shifted toward him. In the dim stage lights, Chiron's figure emerged in a stunning white dress. He placed his hand over his heart, his voice soft, filled with endless love. "My love." The whole auditorium nearly erupted with the sound of cheers from the crowd below. "Senior Shirone." The female students blushed, unable to believe their eyes. "Is that really Shirone?" The male students, on the other hand, were holding their stomachs, laughing uncontrollably. In the front row of the VIP section, Sina's mouth dropped open in sheer shock, speechless. Downstage, Cherelle frowned and turned to call out to Amy, Chiron's faking being a woman, Amy. At that moment, Amy was too stunned by the sweet scene unfolding on stage to speak. Cherelle quickly shook her. "Amy, snap out of it." Meanwhile, under the stage lights, Chiron rushed into Need's arms. Need lovingly embraced her shoulders and said with deep affection, "Olia, I've missed you." Chiron smoothly responded in kind, "Let's never be apart again, no." At this, Neve and Chiron exchanged a loving gaze. Chiron looked up and Neve gently leaned down, as if they were about to share a warm kiss. Mark's face turned pale, while Maria's face was completely red. She stammered, "Don't tell me. It can't be." The male students squinted, trying their hardest to focus and not miss a single moment of what was happening on stage from that point on. Chiron and Neve were almost face to face. Cherelle gasped, "Really?" Amy nervously replied, "In the plays, they actually do it." At that crucial moment, Aruki suddenly appeared wearing blood-soaked armor, standing right behind Need. He opened his mouth wide, looking like he was about to devour Need alive. With a swift motion, Aruki bit down on Need's shoulder. Need screamed in agony, "Help me." The audience, witnessing the bloody scene on stage, was frozen in shock, their eyes wide and mouths agape. The entire auditorium went completely silent. All the lights in the hall went out at once. Maria, frightened, leaned against Mark. "That's kind of scary," she whispered. Mark felt stiff as Maria leaned on him. Just then, a spotlight lit up in the center of the stage, revealing someone holding an ancient book and raising it high. 6 months ago, the origin of this story came from an old diary discovered during the Academy's historical research. Need excitedly explained, "Our research team started studying it immediately, and what we uncovered was shocking. The souls became malevolent because they were infected by evil spirits. Now they wander the underworld, searching for a host to possess." As Need spoke, some students started to feel uneasy. Need's gaze became sharp. Until today, suddenly, a massive bell appeared behind him. The sound of the bell echoed deep and resonant. The students sitting below were startled and exclaimed, "What? Isn't that the bell that rings at midnight? It's not even 7 o'clock yet." Need stood on stage, his voice carrying an eerie tone as he said, "At midnight, when the light has completely vanished, yes, at midnight, the evil spirits will appear." Below, Maria was clearly frightened by Need, while Mark remained unfazed, his face showing nothing but contempt. On stage, Need grinned maliciously. "You've never seen an evil spirit at midnight, have you?" he continued. "Well, that's possible, because evil spirits only show themselves to those they want to see them. But after our presentation, you might feel a little more curious about them, right? In other words, you'll start to tune into the frequency of the spirits. Tonight, when the bell rings at midnight, take a look around. You might just see an evil spirit wandering nearby." At this, the audience below became increasingly uneasy. They whispered anxiously, "What? That's scary." Some try to act brave, boldly declaring, "That's just a lie. I'm staying in the library until midnight tonight." Amid the chatter, Need suddenly announced, "Of course, that's if you're lucky. We'll end the presentation here." The entire auditorium froze for a few seconds, then suddenly the stage lights were turned on all at once. The hall was brightly lit, and the students, confused, said, "What?" The lights came back on. Everyone couldn't believe it. They were bewildered and asked, "Is that all?" Right after that, a shower of paper flew up onto the stage, followed by a loud, furious shout. "Shit, you call this a presentation?" The students angrily protested, "There's no evidence or results. What did you even show us? It's so dumb to trust Shirone and Aruki. I knew this would happen." "Forget those damn spirits," Amy muttered, frustrated, throwing her coat on and storming off. She yelled angrily, "This is so embarrassing. I knew something like this would happen when I got close to those weirdos." Cherelle quickly ran after Amy, calling her Amy. A group of students, rumored to be part of the Gold Rune Club, quietly stood up and left. Only Fermi remained sitting. In the honorary seats, Sena, embarrassed, turned to Alpheus and apologized. "I'm so sorry, Principal." Sena bowed deeply, speaking quickly. "I'll punish those students." She forced a smile, saying awkwardly, "They're from the spiritual group, so it's understandable." Alpheus, on the other hand, showed no reaction. He just waved his hand as if nothing was a big deal. "Don't worry about it. Why would they do something like that?" Sena raised her hand to block her face and sighed. She murmured to herself, "Was I wrong to trust them?" Alpheus walked up to the stage, deep in thought. If they planned to end it like this, it shouldn't have started in the first place. "Isn't that right, Chiron?" Alpheus managed a slight smile, his eyes showing clear confidence. Behind the curtains, Need burst out laughing with delight. He turned to Aruki, grinning. "You see their faces?" Aruki nodded. "Yeah, I saw." You can tell just by looking at their eyes. The confused, bewildered expressions of the students, Maria's worry, Mark's disdainful gaze. Those are the seeds, I'm sure of it. They've been planted. The mysterious bell on stage will also play an important role in this plan. Chiron walked up from behind them, speaking slowly to Need and Aruki. Step 1 has succeeded. With a spark of energy, Chiron added, "Let's show them what a spirit really is." As midnight drew near, the prestigious academy was shrouded in a deep, quiet darkness. The sky was a dark purple, making the atmosphere feel eerie and otherworldly. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking that it was already past 11:30. Need stood outside Chiron's room and called out, "It's time, Chiron. Have you finished the test ship?" Chiron turned around, giving a small nod. Then, he stepped outside with Need. A few days ago, Need had gone out in the rain. He walked all around the school on a very important mission to set up hundreds of 3D projectors all over the campus. The projectors were connected to underground cables, and they would send a program to predict Aruki's actions. Deep in a basement below the ground, Need tiptoed and reminded Chiron, "Be careful as you walk." Aruki checked his watch and calculated, "In 5 minutes and 15 seconds, it'll be midnight." "Wait, no, 9 seconds. We can't be too early or too late. We need to show them the ghost exactly at midnight." Aruki raised his hand to signal, "Start the moment I give the sign." As Need adjusted a few settings on the control panel, he told Chiron, "It's your turn now. It all depends on you." Chiron stepped forward and placed both hands on the white crystal ore. Aruki, across from him, raised his hand to signal ready. Need glanced nervously at Chiron. He raised his voice now immediately. Chiron poured his energy into the crystal orb, and instantly bright light erupted from it. Need shielded his eyes with his hand and marveled. What an incredible source of power. Aruki couldn't help but admire Chiron. He had really developed his magical abilities so much in just 1 month. Need excitedly cheered, "Just like I expected from you, Chiron." However, Chiron didn't seem pleased at all. He frowned deeply and muttered, "This feels strange. It's like I've poured water into a bottomless bowl." Hearing Chiron, Need gasped in surprise. "What? Don't tell me." Need rushed over to the control panel, panic in his voice. "What's wrong with this thing?" Aruki, worried, asked, "What happened? Is something wrong?" Need, on the verge of tears, said, "The output energy isn't increasing. The needle won't budge past 18%. Aruki's fear grew instantly. "How is that possible? Can you fix it?" Need, in a panic, replied, "I don't know. My calculations were perfect. What the hell is going on?" The problem was that the rats had chewed through the transmission pipes, so Chiron's magical energy couldn't reach the projector. After struggling for a moment, Aruki, disappointed, said, "It's over. We've failed." The clock in Aruki's hand showed there were only a few seconds left until midnight. Need hung his head, muttering, "It's all my fault." He blamed himself sadly. "I was so stupid. You released it, and I couldn't even make the device properly." Aruki softly called, "Need." Tears streamed down Need's cheeks as he said, "I'm sorry for dragging you into this. I'm sorry for making you the joke." He wiped his tears with his hand and continued, "I'll take full responsibility no matter what." So, Need turned to Shirone and said, "Stop it. Shirone, let me take responsibility for this." But Shirone firmly responded, "No." He spoke slowly. "We've all worked so hard, sacrificing even our sleep. Need and Haruki, you two should give everything you've got." Shirone's eyes were filled with fierce determination. "I can't let it end like this." It seemed like Aruki realized what Shirone was about to do and urgently shouted, "Need, stop Shirone." Still in a daze, Need asked, "Huh?" After a few seconds, he snapped back to reality and stammered, "No, no way." Panicked, Need shouted, "Is he going to use his immortality ability?" Sure enough, Shirone began activating the energy inside him. His eyes shone brightly as he stepped into an endless spiral of space. Aruki and Need desperately pleaded, "Shirone, stop. Don't go any further." Aruki, growing impatient, shook Shirone hard. Damn, why isn't he stopping? Need grabbed the orb Shirone was holding and yanked it away with all his strength. He cried out, begging Shirone, "Please stop. You'll disappear." Need said through tears, "We can give up on this research group. I don't want to lose you." Shirone softly called his name, Need. His face was unexpectedly calm. "I'm not scared anymore." A flash of blue lightning struck deep within Shirone's consciousness. He felt an immense power taking over his entire body. The power was so overwhelming that Shirone couldn't bear it. He gritted his teeth. A pain groan slipped through his clenched jaw. He recalled what Armen had once said, "I won't disappear." Shirone screamed in agony. His whole body began to dissolve into dust. He told himself, "I need to remember." One by one, beautiful memories flashed before Shirone's eyes like a fast-forwarded film. The moment he ran into his parents' arms, Rada and Ryan's bright smiles, the first time he met Amy and Cherelle, the day spent with Need and Aruki as friends, the trusting gaze of Principal Alpheus, the reunion with Armen, the countless life and death moments they'd survived together, all the endless efforts that led him to this very moment. Each memory reminded Shirone of who he was, and as soon as he knew who he truly was, the immortal energy within him awakened. The process of his disappearance slowed. Even his body began to slowly return to its original state. As Armen had said, Shirone didn't disappear. He opened his eyes and silently promised himself, "I won't run away anymore." Shirone suddenly screamed. Need, panicked, asked him, "Shirone, are you okay?" Shirone shouted, "The exit." Aruki quickly reacted, turning to Need and shouting, "The gauge." Need rushed to the control panel. He froze in shock and exclaimed, "Hey, wait a second." He couldn't believe his eyes. No way. The needle's jumping. The current reading is at 157%. Need, on the verge of tears, quickly signaled to Aruki. Aruki now. In Aruki's hand was a switch. Following Need's command, Aruki decisively flipped the switch. Meanwhile, in the girls' dormitory, Maria's soft voice rang out, "What? Is it already midnight?" Maria Merlang was currently a 7th grade student. She closed her book and said, "What a shame, but I should go to sleep. I've got class tomorrow." Suddenly, Maria shivered, remembering something that sent a chill down her spine. "I forgot. I just remembered the story about the spirit. Does that mean I'll see a ghost at midnight?" She let out a long sigh. "Shirone, there's no such thing as a spirit in this world." As Maria finished speaking, she accidentally turned her head toward the window. Outside, a ghost suddenly appeared, pressing its face against the glass. The ghost had a terrifying look with a skeletal face, drooling and its eyes hollow. Maria's face showed pure terror when she saw it. On the other side, Amy screamed at the top of her lungs, "Get away," followed by the loud crash of a broken glass vase. Standing in front of Amy was a tall, dark figure. Trembling, Amy shouted, "What are you? How did you get in here?" The dark figure was a ghost dressed as a knight, and it taunted Amy. Amy stared wide-eyed at it, thinking, did it just smile? Suddenly, Amy turned and ran. She screamed as she fled. Cherelle, from the next room, rushed into Amy's room. "Amy, a ghost just appeared," she yelled. Amy, still shocked, asked, "Cherelle, you saw it too?" Cherelle, in panic, replied, "Does that mean?" At that moment, both Cherelle and Amy turned their heads toward the back. Sure enough, all the girls from the other rooms were rushing out like bees from a broken hive. The air was filled with loud screams. "A ghost! Run!" Behind them was an army of ghostly soldiers, each with its own terrifying and grotesque appearance. In the school campus, the lights in all the rooms suddenly blazed to life. The entire academy shook violently and screams echoed everywhere. "A ghost! I see a ghost!" Just as Need had warned during the presentation, when the clock struck midnight, evil spirits appeared all at once in their most terrifying forms. The sound of groaning and shrieking filled the air, creating an incredibly frightening atmosphere. Evil spirits were everywhere, from the campus grounds to the classrooms and the students' dorms. The screams grew louder. "Help! They're even up in the sky!" The entire school was shaken in one night by the chaos caused by the evil spirits. Everyone was in a panic. Why do they keep chasing us? Don't come any closer. The school's ancient tower hadn't been disturbed like this in years. Students ran out into the yard and gathered in a group. The female students huddled together, crying softly, "Do something." The male students tried to use magic to fight back against the evil spirits. A male student with light brown hair nervously said, "They're everywhere. Just attack." The footsteps of the evil spirits grew louder and louder. There were indeed too many of them, and their appearances were horrifying. The students no longer had the courage to fight. They burst into tears and frantically scrambled to run in every direction. At that moment, the evil spirits suddenly disappeared. The students stared in confusion and asked, "They're gone." One male student, still wiping away tears, questioned doubtfully. The male student standing next to him looked up. "Ha! There's someone on the roof." On the roof, Shirone, and Aruki stood proudly, looking down at the students below. Need clapped his hands a few times and said nonchalantly, "Our presentation was delayed, but you all still showed up." Need placed a hand on his chest and said seriously, "Thank you." Suddenly, an angry voice shouted, "You kids." It was Sina. She was running toward them, fuming as she scolded. "Get down here right now. It's past midnight. What's all this chaos about?" In her hands, Sina was holding a projector that Need had set up earlier. She was visibly irritated, especially since she had been in the middle of her bath when all of this started. Seeing her, Need gave a casual salute and winked playfully at Sina. "The night is beautiful, isn't it?" "Good evening, Professor Sina." When the students saw the projector Sina had brought, they suddenly realized. A 3D projector? So those spirits were fake. Someone in the crowd laughed. Sina turned around and was surprised to see it was Alphys. She asked, "Principal, what are you doing here?" Alphys calmly replied, "I thought the presentation wasn't over yet, so let's listen to the rest." On the roof, the research team excitedly presented their findings to the students below. "Hey everyone, according to our research, the soul does exist. Do you all believe in the supernatural?" The students below immediately reacted with strong opposition, led by a boy with light brown hair. He loudly scolded the group, "Those scammers are still going on. What do you mean the soul exists? They're all fake, using tricks so simple, a 3-year-old could pull them off." After saying the words simple tricks, the boy suddenly felt something was off. Two girls behind him turned to each other and whispered, "But how are they doing it?" The boy quickly spun around and confidently said, "What are you talking about? Of course, they're using 3D magic." The girls still weren't satisfied with the boy's answer. They explained, "But it's weird. How can the 3D projections move differently?" Immediately, the entire school campus became lively with chatter. The students began eagerly discussing it amongst themselves. "Ever since I found out they were fake, I've been thinking about it, but I still don't know. I think they're using projections from a machine, but can they really cover the whole school? They need a huge amount of data and energy." Alpheus used his magical power to create a playful, ghostly figure. He laughed and asked Sina, "So, what do you think?" With a mischievous smile, Alpheus asked Sina, "Can you explain the trick they use, Professor Sina?" She smiled helplessly, adjusted her glasses, and chose her words carefully. "Their trick is pretty advanced." On the roof, Shirone stood beside Need, smiling quietly to himself, thinking, for wizards, the most important thing is intelligence. They can't resist their curiosity and get drawn in. This is something that the oldest ancient texts have always said. The male students who had mocked Need's group earlier were now furious. "I can't believe I was tricked by a 5th grader. This is so frustrating." One male student with light brown hair was so angry his whole body was shaking, veins popping on his forehead. "I don't know what mechanism they used. The performance was impressive, but it still doesn't fully convince Sina." She furrowed her brows and turned to Alpheus, saying their trick was difficult to pull off, but it's still not enough for us to approve their research group. Alpheus simply smiled in response. Calmly, he said to Sina, "Actually, this trick isn't all that important." Sina was momentarily puzzled by Alpheus' words. Meanwhile, the students continued to criticize Need's group from below. "It's still fake. There's no such thing as a soul." The male student with the light brown hair was the most agitated. He pointed at Need, shouting angrily, "What does a fake soul have to do with supernatural research?" Need laughed. Well, you still don't believe in supernatural research, huh?" The students below answered in unison, "Of course not. That was just a performance trick." Need spoke calmly. "Let me ask you all, why are you here? Why is it that every student is suddenly speechless in my question?" He continued, "What is it that you're afraid of, and why did you run away? If souls or ghosts aren't real, then why are you all so scared?" The students below hesitated, unable to respond. Amy and Cherelle, like the others, could only remain silent. At this moment, Need narrowed his eyes and added, "Your feelings right now are exactly what the research on supernatural souls is all about. His voice was slow, but it hit the core of the students' thoughts. All of you who don't believe in souls, yet when you see a ghost, you feel fear. It's because deep down, you have a seed of doubt that maybe, just maybe, souls and ghosts do exist. Need uses rhetorical skills to gradually persuade everyone. We're simply showing you that tiny seed of doubt. We don't know if they exist or not, but we're studying that doubt, and that's the whole point of this research. As Need spoke, Shirone and Aruki quietly nodded to each other. Below, a female student with chestnut-colored hair covered her mouth and whispered, "That's right. There was a time when everything we knew was considered true. Now, it's being seen as a lie from the past." On the school stage, Need's voice rang out powerfully. "Because everyone doubted us, we have proven that our research team is valuable." And with that, the presentation by the supernatural science research team came to an end. At this point, all three, Chiron, Need, and Aruki, bowed deeply, facing the students and teachers below, and said, "Thank you so much." The students turned to one another, smiling. The boy with light brown hair crooked grin. Immediately after, the whole campus erupted in cheers from the students. "That was amazing. We're on board. If it's a special performance like this, I'd let you trip me as many times as you want." Standing behind the students were the teachers. Alfie, as with his hands clasped behind his back, spoke in his usual steady voice, but there was an undeniable authority in it, like someone who knew what was coming. "Where do we come from, and what does the future hold? Some are exploring doubt and revealing things unseen. What do the teachers think?" Saina remained silent. Alpheus smiled and made a comment. "I think this presentation has real meaning." Thad, standing beside him, respectfully responded, "I have no objections, headmaster." Saina sighed, "I understand. All right then." Saina stood tall and formally declared, "The professors have decided we will officially recognize the presentation from the Supernatural Soul Research Team." Upon hearing this, the three members of the group couldn't hide their excitement. "So," a vein popped on Saina's forehead. She angrily yelled, "Instead, you're all suspended for 3 days, you idiots." Despite the suspension, Aruki and Shirone embraced each other, bursting with overwhelming joy. "We did it! We succeeded! We did it!" They cheered. Below, the other students shared in their happiness. "Congrats! Give it your all." Saina realized no one was paying attention to her, and in frustration, she shouted, "Are you even listening to your professor? I said you're suspended." Maria turned to Mark and said, "Wow, Senior Shirone really is." Mark immediately responded with a cool statement, "She's really awesome." Mark's eyes sparkled with admiration. "Senior Shirone is a genius." Cherelle looked at Chiron's group with admiration, saying, "Oh my gosh, they're so cool. Everyone would want to do something like that at least once, make the world stop and stare in awe." Amy stood beside her in silence. She thought to herself, "I can't believe this. While I'm buried in my studies trying to graduate, you're wasting time on something so pointless." Looking at Chiron's bright smile, Amy pouted and snorted in annoyance. Amy looked up at the twinkling stars in the sky, quietly thinking to herself, "I'm a little jealous, just a tiny bit." In a hidden corner, a group of faceless figures dressed in black watched angrily as Chiron's team succeeded. One of them clicked his tongue and muttered, "Ha! A skinny camel is still bigger than a horse." It was frustrating to see a group of graduates being outdone by a bunch of unruly kids. Another person crossed his arms and complained, "Forget about taking istas for ourselves. My team's language research on ants needs rescuing." Someone else interrupted, "They're still just 5th graders. Don't tell me you're just going to back off and run away." The one from the ant language research team snapped, "What? But they'll be graduating soon enough." A figure with a feminine posture covering his mouth mocked, "If you don't want to face them next year, you better graduate this year." The ant language researcher was shaking with anger as he retorted, "You better keep quiet, you doll-collecting weirdo." Furious, the ant language researcher started picking fights with the others, and you too. The hide-and-seek research team. Fermi, who had been silently standing with his arms crossed, finally spoke up, cutting through the tension. His voice was cold, carrying the authority of a leader. "All right, that's enough. Stop it here, or we'll draw attention to ourselves." Fermi smirked, and his words came out with a sly, difficult-to-read tone. "All of us being here like this will only end up hurting ourselves. Just wait for the right moment." From a distance, Saina quietly observed Fermi's group. She sighed and thought to herself, "Those rookies from those shady research groups." She wanted to scream and yell, "Grow up and help her out." Alpheus extended his hand and used the magic Shirone had employed to shape the evil spirits. He chuckled, nodding in approval. "It's really beautiful." Alpheus stroked his beard and smiled, complimenting Shirone. "Even I, a specialist in light magic, am amazed. The way it's been used like this surprised me." He looked up at the sky, admiring the mystical beauty of the stars. Alpheus was clearly pleased as he remarked, "You've completed a pretty tough mission, Shirone. Back then, I thought you wouldn't be able to do it. I thought you were just a kid with limited potential, but I was wrong. As he said this, Alpheus looked down at the keepsake in his hand. He whispered, maybe in the future you'll have the power to fulfill my dream. With that, Alpheus gripped the keepsake tightly in his hand. Meanwhile, Shirone was lying on the grass, smiling with joy. This feels amazing, he said. Need lay next to him. He gently tapped Shirone, a little worried, and asked, are you really okay? Are you sure you're fine? Shirone smiled reassuringly at Need. Yeah, I'm fine. Aruki sat up and teased Shirone. You're crazy. Who risks their life for something like this? Hearing Aruki's teasing, Shirone just smiled. Aruki gave him a sidelong glance and said, but you're still the best. Need sat up, agreeing with Aruki. You're right, he said. If Shirone hadn't used his unique ability, he wouldn't have made it. But when I think about the risk of putting his life on the line for it, Aruki lay back down and laughed. In the end, it was just luck that got us through. Thinking about how Shirone could possibly disappear when using his immortality power, Aruki firmly added, but you're really crazy, you know that? Shirone blushed, feeling a little embarrassed as his two friends kept complimenting him. He awkwardly said, why are you two only praising me? You both are geniuses too. Aruki, you're amazing for being able to predict how every student will react across the entire school. Aruki, flustered by the compliment, looked away shyly. Shirone then turned to praise Need. Need, you're incredible for being able to create so many machines. And that's just the beginning. Like Aruki, Need turned red, his face as bright as a tomato. All three of them felt embarrassed, their faces burning with shyness. Aruki, feeling a bit awkward, said, oh, I can't believe you're actually being modest now. Need stammered, clearly flustered. You guys know. You're making me so embarrassed. Shirone stretched his hand out as if trying to touch the distant, shining stars in the sky. He shared, for me, I want to reach higher like those bright stars up there. At this point, Shirone's eyes shone with a glimmer of belief and hope. Aruki also glanced up at the sky. He muttered softly, so, what do you think, Doctor? I've been practicing a lot lately. Should I start thinking about advancing my career now? Hearing this, Need quickly sat up. With excitement, he said, that's a great idea. The three of us should graduate together. Once we join the outside world after graduation, I'm sure there will be even more fun things waiting for us out there. Shirone raised an eyebrow and looked at Need. He mumbled, the outside world, huh? Aruki, hearing Need, sat up as well. He smiled a little and said, sounds good. Isn't it about time we started living confidently and comfortably? Need eagerly extended his hand. Promise me, he declared boldly, we'll stick together until the end. Shirone placed his hand on Need's and responded, yeah, we'll be the strongest. Aruki was the last to place his hand on theirs. He softly asked, but what should we use to cheer each other on and keep this promise now? Need shrugged and replied, who knows, we'll just use whatever we have. Suddenly Need had an idea. He pointed to the brightest star in the sky and shouted, long live supernatural science. Aruki immediately joined in saying, don't give up, three little sheep. Shirone reached out with determination saying, let's graduate together. Need then pointed at Aruki, teasing, what kind of cheering is that? Aruki laughed, I just said we'll try our best, just like the three little sheep. Shirone, sitting between them, laughed until tears rolled down his face. In his heart, he silently wished, together, we will become the strongest wizards.